He grabbed her by the hair, not her arm, not her wrist. Her hair a fistful of it, and he yanked so hard that Mara Ellsworth's scream came out as nothing but air. Her knees hit the creek bank before she even understood what was happening. Tin cups she'd been washing tumbled into the water and disappeared. "Time's up, widow woman," Buck Harlan said. His two friends were already moving to flank her. "Town's done being patient with you." Patient. As if watching her starve for 8 months had been some kind of courtesy. If you saw a woman being dragged through the dirt by 3 men while an entire town watched in silence, what would you do? Would you look away? Would you tell yourself it wasn't your business? 2 little girls didn't ask those questions. They just stepped into the road, and nothing was ever the same again. Before we go any further, if stories like this one move you, if you believe that dignity is something every human being deserves no matter what they've lost, please subscribe to this channel and hit the like button. Drop your city and country in the comments below, because I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that dirt road in Blackthorn Crossing, Wyoming, and stay there until the very end. The morning it all broke open began the way most of Mara Ellsworth's mornings had begun for the past 8 months, quietly, without ceremony, and with a hunger that had long since stopped feeling and sharp and started feeling like weather. Just a constant condition of being alive. She had slept in the lean-to behind Hector Pruitt's dry goods store for 3 nights running. Hector hadn't given her permission, but he hadn't chased her off either, which in Blackthorn Crossing amounted to the same thing as kindness. She kept herself small and still and left before the sun fully cleared the mountains. She took nothing that wasn't hers. She asked for nothing from anyone. That was the strategy. Keep low. Keep quiet. Make yourself small enough that people forget to hate you. It hadn't worked. Mara was 29 years old and looked 43. She knew it because she'd caught her reflection in the window of the millinery shop and hadn't recognized the woman looking back at her, the hollowed cheeks, the careful, watchful eyes, the way she held her shoulders slightly raised as though bracing for a blow might come from any direction. Her hands, which had once been her quiet pride capable, sure hands that could cure a ham, stitch a fine seam, coax bread from a stubborn oven were cracked and stained now, the knuckles swollen from cold water and harder use. Her husband Daniel had been dead 14 months. 14 months was long enough, apparently, for a town to go from leaving casseroles on your porch to leaving nothing at all. Daniel Ellsworth had been a decent man. Not a great one. He drank more than he should have in his last 2 years, spent more than they had, borrowed against the land twice without telling her. When the fever took him in October of the previous year, it left behind a property Mara couldn't pay taxes on and debt she hadn't known existed. She'd sold what she could. She'd taken in washing, then sewing, then anything. Mrs. Calloway had hired her to clean the boarding house for 3 weeks, and then decided she made the other guests uncomfortable and stopped paying her for the last week's work. Mara had not made a scene about it. She'd needed a reference more than she'd needed the argument. What she'd gotten was neither. By spring, she was sleeping in places that weren't hers, eating what people left behind, wearing the same 2 dresses, until one of them gave out entirely at both elbows. She told herself every morning that she was getting through this, that something would turn, that a woman who had kept a clean house and raised a kitchen garden and nursed a undying husband for 4 months, without complaint, was not someone the world was simply going to swallow whole. The world had different ideas. It was the way they looked at her that was the worst of it. Not with cruelty, exactly, though there was plenty of that too, but with a particular kind of blankness, like she had become scenery, like the act of losing everything had slowly transformed her from a person into a problem, and problems didn't require eye contact. Reverend Cole had told her very gently that perhaps she should consider moving on. There were towns further east that had more resources. He'd said it, say something you've been rehearsing. He'd said it the way you say something when you've already decided but want it to sound like suggestion. She'd nodded and thanked him and walked out of the church and stood in the road for a long moment wondering where, exactly, he thought she should go. She had no family. Daniel's family was back in Missouri and had made clear, through silences alone, that they had no intention of claiming a widowed daughter-in-law who came with nothing but grief and obligation. She had no money for a stage ticket east. She had no connections in any town further west. She had Blackthorn Crossing, Wyoming, and Blackthorn Crossing had made it increasingly, methodically clear that it was done with her. That was the morning Buck Harlan decided to make it official. She had gone to the creek, the lower stretch, past the mill, where people weren't usually around so early to wash her face and the cup she'd been using, and to fill the small canteen she carried. It wasn't her creek. She knew that. Nothing in this town was hers anymore. But water wasn't something you could charge for, or at least it hadn't been, and she had told herself the lower creek was safe enough. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on gravel, unhurried, the kind of walking that means you've already decided how this ends. She'd turned just as Buck Harlan came around the bend in the trail, with Clem Dozer and Pete Worley behind him, and even before he opened his mouth, something in her stomach already knew. Buck was not a complicated man. He ran the livery stable at the north end of Main Street and fancied himself a kind of informal enforcer of community standards. He'd taken a particular dislike to Mara that seemed to have no origin she could identify. He'd simply decided, somewhere in the past several months, that her continued presence in Blackthorn Crossing was a personal affront. Figured we'd find you down here, he said. He wasn't angry. That was the thing that made it worse. He sounded satisfied, like a man completing a chore. I'm not bothering anyone, Mara said. Kept her voice even. She had a lot of practice keeping her voice even. You bother me just by existing, Buck said pleasantly. He looked at Clem, then at Pete, and something passed between them that she'd seen before, that male language of agreement that requires no words. Town meeting last week. People been talking. We decided it's time someone made things official. There was no town meeting, Mara said. Informal, Clem offered. You weren't invited, Pete said, and then laughed at his own joke. She started to back up, which was a mistake. It showed them something they'd been waiting to see, and that was when Buck moved. Not slowly, not hesitantly, with the casual reach of a man who had never in his life been stopped from taking what he wanted. He grabbed her by the hair. The sound she made was involuntary and ugly. Her knees hit the creek bank, the gravel, biting through the thin fabric of her skirt and the tin cup she'd been holding, hit the water and turned over in the current. She grabbed at his wrist with both hands out of pure reflex, not resistance. Her brain hadn't caught up to her hands yet, and he yanked her to her feet by the same grip, close enough that she could smell tobacco and horse sweat. Here's what's happening, Buck said, conversational, like they were discussing the weather. You're walking out of this town today. We're going to help you do it. You have no right. I've got two friends, said. That's right enough. What followed was something Mara would spend a long time afterward trying not to think about too clearly. Not because it was the worst thing that had ever happened to her. She had held her husband's hand while he convulsed with fever. She had stood in front of a judge who auctioned her own home from under her, while she watched, but because of the quality of the humiliation, the particular texture of being dragged. They walked her up from the creek bank and onto the lower end of Main Street, Buck with his hand still fisted in her hair, Clem and Pete loose on either side like they were escorting her somewhere pleasant. She stumbled twice. Her shoes, or the things that still technically counted as shoes, were not meant for stumbling. The second time she went down to one knee on the road, and Buck yanked her back up without slowing. People saw. That was the part that cut deepest, in a place below rage or fear. People saw, and they stood in doorways and on boardwalks, and at the edges of the road, and they watched the way people watch a fire in someone else's building, with that careful distance that lets you tell yourself afterward that there was nothing you could have done. Mara stopped crying about 20 feet in. She didn't decide to stop her face, simply ran out of the particular energy required for it. What replaced the tears was something quieter and more dangerous, a kind of settling into the reality of the moment, the way a body settles when it understands that fighting will only make the grip tighten. She looked at the faces watching her. Hector Pruitt, who had let her sleep behind his store. He was looking at something above her head. Mrs. Calloway, who had not paid her for a week of work. She had her handkerchief pressed to her mouth. Reverend Cole, who had suggested she consider moving on. He had turned away entirely. 30 feet. 40. The end of Main Street was visible now, the place where the road narrowed and began its long lean toward the open plain, and Mara understood with a clarity that had nothing to do with hope that they were going to walk her out to that narrowing and keep going until she was simply gone. Most of its windows were dark, and then Buck Harlan was going to walk back to his livery stable and have his dinner and sleep perfectly well, because there was no one in this town who was going to make him feel otherwise. She was thinking this, specifically this, not escape routes or arguments, or what came next, just the terrible arithmetic of a life being erased when she heard the voice. Small absolute, directly in the road ahead. Stop. Buck stopped. Not because the voice frightened him, it was, after all, the voice of a child, but because the surprise of it was enough to interrupt momentum, and in that half-second of interruption, Mara looked up. 2 girls stood in the road. The older one was maybe 8, with dark braids and the kind of eyes that have already seen too much world and decided to look at it anyway. The younger one, 6, maybe smaller, clutching the back of her sister's dress with both fists, was watching Buck Harlan, with an expression that was not fear so much as concentrated fury, the fury of a small person who has been frightened before and resents it deeply. "Move along, girl," Buck said, recovering. He started forward again. The older one didn't move. She straightened, actually stood a little taller, which is something Mara had stopped knowing how to do. "She's not a problem," the girl said, and her voice didn't shake at all. "She's a person." Buck laughed, but it wasn't a comfortable laugh. "Get out of the road before I move you. Tessa." The voice that came next was low, and even from behind the girls a man's voice, unhurried, with the particular quality of a voice accustomed to being heard once. "Stay where you are." The man who stepped forward from the mouth of the alley beside the mill was not physically imposing in the theatrical way that men in stories about frontier justice tend to be. He was tall enough, lean enough, weathered quiet that accumulates in men who have spent years working land that doesn't give anything back easily. His coat had been mended in 2 places. His hat was old. He carried no weapon that Mara could see, and that absence of visible weapons, she would later realize, was what made Buck Harlan's grip in her hair go fractionally, involuntarily looser. Because a man who walks toward trouble without showing a weapon either has one you haven't seen yet, or has decided he doesn't need one. Neither option was comfortable. "Rowan Thorne," Buck said, and now the satisfaction was gone from his voice, replaced by something that wasn't quite wariness, but was considering its options. "This doesn't concern you." "Release her," Rowan Thorne said. He had not broken stride. "Man, this woman has been a burden on this community for—" "I didn't ask for your accounting." Rowan stopped 6 feet away. He looked at Buck the way a man looks at a problem he has already worked out. "Release her." The silence that followed lasted longer than silence usually does. Mara could feel the grip in her hair, could feel Buck's thinking in it, the slight shift of his hand as he calculated what Rowan Thorne was and was not willing to do. She could feel Clem and Pete recalibrating on either side of her, the way men do when the situation has suddenly acquired a dimension they hadn't planned for. "There's 3 of us," Buck said. "There are," Rowan agreed. Another silence. A different kind. Buck released her hair. It was not a gracious release. He opened his hand and let her hair fall and stepped back in a way that was clearly meant to communicate choice rather than defeat. "This isn't finished," he said to Rowan. And then, because he needed to say something to Mara too, "You'll wish you'd walked when we gave you the chance." Rowan had turned to look at Mara by then, to the strange, disorienting experience of being looked at by someone who was simply looking at her, not past her, not through her, not with the particular averted quality of someone who has decided she was no longer quite real. Just looking at her with gray eyes and a kind of steady attention that she hadn't felt directed at her in a very long time. He held out his hand. Not as command, not as charity, just as offer. "Take it or don't. Your choice." Mara looked at his hand. She looked at the road behind him, the 2 girls still standing there, the younger one watching her with enormous brown eyes, the older one with that same expression of decided watchfulness. She looked at the faces along the boardwalks, at the people who had watched her being dragged, and said nothing and done nothing, and would go home tonight and eat their suppers, and sleep in beds she would never in her life have access to again. She thought about what it would mean to take a stranger's hand, what it would mean to walk away from the one place that, however badly it had broken her, was still the only ground she knew. She thought about Buck Harlan's hand in her hair. And Mara Ellsworth did the most frightening thing she had done in 14 months of very frightening things. She took Rowan Thorne's hand. She stood up straight. She did not look back at Buck Harlan or Clem Dozer or Pete Worley. She did not look at Mrs. Calloway or Reverend Cole or Hector Pruitt or any of the other people who had watched her become invisible and then watched her get dragged and had found it equally easy to absorb both. She walked out of Blackthorn, crossing with a stranger's hand warm around hers, and two little girls falling into step beside her, and the sound of her own footsteps on the road was the loudest thing she had ever heard. The younger girl, the 6-year-old, Nell, reached up after about 30 paces and took Mara's other hand. Mara almost lost her composure then. Almost, but not quite. She kept walking. She had no idea where she was going. She had no idea who this man was, what he wanted, what came next, whether she'd traded one kind of danger for another. These were not foolish concerns, and she was not a foolish woman. And the part of her brain that had kept her alive for 14 months was already asking questions she didn't have answers to. But her feet kept moving, and the hand holding hers didn't tighten or pull or redirect, just held, steady, like a thing that had decided to be steady and had no particular need to announce it. And for the first time in 14 months, Mara Ellsworth walked somewhere instead of just away. The road out of Blackthorn Crossing was 3 miles of pine-scented silence, and Mara spent most of it waiting for the other shoe to drop. That was the honest truth of it. She walked beside Rowan Thorne, with Nell's small hand still tucked into hers, and Tessa ranging slightly ahead the way older children do when they've decided to pretend they're leading, and the part of Mara's brain that had kept her alive through 14 months of steadily worsening circumstances was running calculations she didn't particularly want to be running. Who was this man? What he wanted? What the cost of this would turn out to be, because everything had a cost, and she had learned that particular lesson so many times and in so many ways that it had stopped feeling like wisdom and started feeling like weather, just a permanent condition of being a woman alone in the world. She didn't ask him anything for the first mile. Neither did he offer anything. The girls talked to each other in that half-language that children develop between themselves, references and shorthand that meant nothing to an outsider. And Rowan walked with the unhurried stride of a man who had made this particular walk enough times that his feet knew it without being told. It was Tessa who finally broke the adult silence, because 8-year-olds have a limited tolerance for things that need saying going unsaid. "Her name's Mara," Tessa announced, to no one in particular. "I heard them say it." "I know," Rowan said. Tessa looked at Mara. "I'm Tessa. That's Nell. She doesn't always talk to strangers, but she held your hand, so that means she likes you." Nell, apparently deciding this assessment was accurate, tightened her grip briefly in confirmation. "I'm grateful," Mara said, and even as she said it, she felt how inadequate the word was, how it was the word you used when you didn't have access to the real one. She looked down at Nell's face, the serious brown eyes, and the small stubborn jaw, and felt something move in her chest that she didn't have a name for either. "Both of you. What you did back there." "Tessa does that," Nell said very seriously. "She steps in front of things." "Someone's got to," Tessa said, with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who has already decided this about herself and is not looking for debate. Rowan said nothing. He was watching the tree line ahead, and Mara had the impression, not quite suspicion, not quite comfort, that he listened to the girls the way you listen to something you value, not just tolerate. There was no performance of patience in it. He simply heard them. The cabin appeared through the pines without warning, which was probably intentional. It sat on a natural shelf of land where the hill flattened out, backed against a rock face that would keep the north wind off it in winter, with a creak she could hear before she could see it running somewhere to the east. It was not a romantic structure. The logs had been replaced in sections over what looked like many years, so the walls told the story of their own repairs. Some wood weathered, nearly black, and some still pale and recent. Porch needed leveling on the left side. The roof was solid. There was a kitchen garden along the south wall that had been put in seriously, not casually the kind of garden someone tends because they need it, not because they like the idea of gardening. Mara took all of this in and understood, without being told, that she was looking at a life built by hand. Not quickly, not easily. "There's a room," Rowan said, stopping at the porch steps, off the back. It was a storage room. "I cleaned it out last winter, thinking I'd expand the girls' space. But they decided they didn't want to be separated, so it's been sitting empty." He said this with the careful neutrality of a man laying something on a table that you can pick up or not. It's yours if you want it. No conditions attached to that. Mara looked at the cabin. She looked at him. I don't know you, she said. Not accusation, just fact. No, he agreed. You don't. Men who offer things to women they don't know usually want something. He met her eyes and held them, and she braced herself for the particular brand of wounded dignity that men produce, when they feel their charity is being questioned. Instead, he just nodded, slightly, as though she'd said something accurate that he didn't see any reason to argue with. That's been true in my experience too, he said. I'm not going to tell you I'm different and expect you to believe it. You'd be a fool to believe it, and you're not a fool. He looked at the cabin door. Tessa and Nell are going to go inside and start supper, because it's getting on toward evening, and we're all hungry. You can come in, or you can sit on that stump over there and think about it. Neither one makes you ungrateful. He went up the porch steps and opened the door, and Tessa and Nell tumbled past him inside, and he paused in the doorway and looked back at her once, just once, not waiting for an answer, and then he went in. Marcia stood in the yard. She stood there for probably 4 minutes, which felt longer. The light was going gold through the pines. The creek she couldn't see was doing what creeks do, which is continue being a creek, regardless of human difficulty. Most of it's a cabin. Somewhere inside the cabin, she could hear telling Nell something emphatic about where the cornmeal was kept. She went up the porch steps. The room Rowan had described was exactly what he'd said. It was a back room off the main cabin, with a small window that looked east and a rope bed with a straw mattress that had seen better decades but was horizontal and private, which at that particular moment were the two qualities Mara valued most in the world. There was a hook on the wall for hanging things. There was a wooden crate that could serve as a table. There was a folded blanket on the bed that smelled of cedar. She sat on the edge of the mattress and put her hands in her lap and looked at the wall. She did not cry. She had cried in the road, involuntarily, when Buck Harlan had her by the hair, and that had been her body's decision, not hers. Now her body was apparently done with it, and she just sat and looked at the notched log wall and breathed. After a moment, she heard small feet in the hallway, and Nell appeared in the doorway, with a cup of water held in both hands with the concentration of a child carrying something precious. Rowan said you might want this, Nell said. Mara took the cup. The water was cold and tasted of minerals, and she drank the whole thing. Thank you, Nell. Nell watched her with those enormous eyes. Your hair's still messy from where he grabbed it. I know. Tessa has a comb. She'll probably give it to you if you ask. I'll ask her. Nell seemed satisfied with this. She retrieved the cup and looked at Mara for another moment with the frank assessment of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't looking. I'm glad you came inside, Nell said. Then she left. Mara sat alone in the small room and listened to the sounds of the cabin around her, the specific, layered sounds of people living in a space. Tessa arguing mildly with someone about the cornmeal. Cast iron pan making contact with a stovetop. Rowan's voice, brief and low, settling something. The smell of wood smoke beginning to creep under the door. She couldn't remember the last time she had been inside a space that had sounds like that. Stayed. The first week was not comfortable. Mara would have mistrusted it if it had been. She woke each of the first 3 mornings with the particular jolt of a person who has spent months sleeping in places where she could be asked to leave. And each morning it took a few seconds for her brain to catch up with her body and inform her that she was for the moment somewhere she was allowed to be. That recalibration was its own kind of exhaustion, the work of unlearning emergency. She started earning her place the only way she knew, which was work. She was up before the girls, had the stove going and water on before Rowan came through the main room at dawn. She found where things were kept by looking, not asking flour and cornmeal and dried beans in the larder, the axe behind the door, the mending basket on the left side of the hearth. She was good at reading a household. She'd run one for 7 years. Rowan didn't comment on this. He didn't thank her effusively or make a production of her contribution. He just incorporated it the way you incorporate something that makes sense, with a slight shift in routine and nothing more, and that absence of ceremony was, strangely, exactly what she needed. Being thanked too much for ordinary work was its own kind of reduction. On the 4th morning, he came into the kitchen and found her frowning at the heel on one of Tessa's boots, which had come 3/4 of the way off and was being held on primarily by optimism. "I need an awl and some leather," she said, without looking up. "Do you have them?" "Tack room," he said, "east wall." She found them, repaired the boot, moved on to Nell's coat, which had a tear along the left side seam that someone had attempted to mend with the wrong thread and hadn't gotten far. She spent the better part of the morning on it. When she was done, she had a list in her head of what else needed doing and a clearer sense of how the household was being managed, which was adequately, by a man who knew how to keep people alive and fed and sheltered, and was less experienced at the 1,000 small repairs that accumulate when you're raising children without a second pair of hands. She was not going to be a burden here. She had decided that on the stump in the yard, the first evening in the 4 minutes before she went inside. She did not know yet what this arrangement was or what it would become, but she knew what it was not going to be. It was not going to be charity she accepted passively. She had too much left in her for that. What she hadn't anticipated was the girls. Tessa was something. Not an easy child, there was nothing soft or simple about her, and she watched Mara in those first days with an attention that was slightly unnerving, the way a small child watches when they've learned that adults require monitoring. She was helpful, specifically and selectively helpful, in the way of a child who has figured out that useful is a form of safety. She knew where everything was. She knew how things worked. She knew the names of 3 different edible plants in the surrounding woods and had apparently memorized the distance from the cabin to the creek in paces. 412, she told Mara on the second day, when Mara came back from fetching water and mentioned she hadn't realized how far it was. 412 what? Steps. If you step normal. Rowan says if you count things, you don't get lost. Mara considered this. That's good advice. He gives good advice, Tessa said, with the loyalty of someone who has decided on a person and doesn't see the point in hedging about it. Nell was different, softer in some places, more stubborn in others, with a 6-year-old's absolute confidence in her own emotional assessments. By the end of the first week, she had decided that Mara was permanent, a conclusion she had reached independently of any evidence or adult confirmation, and she began treating her accordingly. She brought Mara things: a smooth creek stone she found interesting, half a biscuit she'd saved, a drawing she'd done on the back of a piece of wrapping paper that appeared to depict a horse, but might have been anything. "That's our family," Nell said, pointing at the drawing. Mara looked at the 5 wobbly figures in a row. "Who's who?" Nell pointed from left to right. "Rowan, Tessa, me, you. And that's the cat, but we don't have a cat yet." "We don't have a cat," Mara confirmed. "We should," Nell said, and drifted away to other concerns. Mara folded the drawing carefully and put it on the wooden crate in her room. It was on a Thursday. She'd started keeping track of days again, which felt significant that she finally asked the question that had been sitting at the back of everything. She and Rowan were in the kitchen after the girls had gone to bed, her working on mending by the lamp and him sharpening a blade, and the silence between them had reached the particular quality that means both people are thinking about the same without having said so. "They're not yours," she said. "Not a question." He set down the blade. "No, then how?" Rowan was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Then I came through Ellerton about 2 years back, town about 60 miles east. There was a place there, orphan institution, they called it. Industrial home for dependent children, officially." He said the official name with the particular flatness of someone repeating words they find obscene. "I had business in town, stayed overnight. Saw Tessa through a fence. She had a bruise across her face, and she was standing over Nell with her arms out, and 2 older boys were giving them trouble." He picked up the blade again, but didn't resume sharpening. Something about the way she was standing. She wasn't crying. She was just standing there, covering that little girl, completely outmatched, and not moving. He was quiet again for a moment. "I recognized something," he said finally. "I went and spoke to the administrator, tried to pay what they asked. He wanted more than I had, so I went away and came back 3 weeks later with the rest." He set the blade down again, this time for good. It's all, it was not all. She could hear what was not being said, the weeks of figuring out how to have more money. The question of what he'd recognized in Tessa's stance that had moved a solitary mountain homesteader to change his entire life for 2 small strangers. But she didn't push. She understood something about stories that contained more than the surface version. She had one of those herself. "They're lucky," she said. I'm the lucky one, he said, simply and without performance, and went back to his sharpening. The days built on each other the way days do when you're not constantly spending all of your energy simply surviving. Mara began to sleep through the night, which had not happened in over a year. She began to eat regularly enough that her hands stopped hurting quite so much. She began to recover the capability she'd always had, which had been buried under crisis, her eye for what needed doing, her sense of how a day's work fit together, the small competencies that she had always taken for granted until they were all she had left. She cooked better than Rowan, which she established diplomatically, and he acknowledged without ego. So she took the cooking, and he took over the heavier outside work that she couldn't manage as well. It wasn't discussed as an arrangement. It just became one. She started teaching the girls their letters and sums, which she'd learned herself from a school teacher mother who'd believed women needed to know what was written on the documents they were asked to sign. Tessa was aggressive about learning, approached reading the way she approached everything as a problem to be solved and then mastered and then set aside. Nell liked stories and had a memory for numbers that startled Mara more than once. "Where did you go to school?" Tessa asked one afternoon, not looking up from the slate she was working on. "My mother taught me," Mara said. "Where's your mother now?" "She died when I was 17. Tessa processed this. "Did you have a husband?" "Yes." "He died too." "Did you have children?" Question was asked with the unguarded directness of a child who doesn't know yet that some questions bruise. Mara felt it but didn't let it show. "No," she said. "We didn't." Tessa looked up then with those watchful eyes. "That's sad, it is," Mara agreed. "We could be yours," Tessa said, "if you wanted. We don't have a mother and you don't have children, so it seems like it would work out." Mara looked at her for a long moment. 8 years old, this child, with her practical logic and her measuring eyes and the bruise that had apparently been on her face when Rowan found her, and that Mara sometimes thought she could still see the ghost of. "I think that might be the best idea I've heard in a very long time," Mara said. Tessa nodded, satisfied, and went back to her slate. The knock came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after Mara had come to the cabin. She was in the yard hanging laundry when she heard the horse on the trail, and she heard it wrong, not the rhythm of someone arriving, but the rhythm of someone who had been waiting to arrive, which is different, which is the rhythm of intention rather than journey. She turned and saw the man on the gray horse come through the trees and felt, before her brain had processed his face, the particular cold in her stomach that her body had developed over the past year as an early warning system. His name, she learned about 30 seconds later, was Silas Vane. He was around 50, dressed better than the territory warranted, with the kind of face that has learned to perform warmth so well that you only notice the absence of it when you look directly into his eyes, which were the color of shallow river water and had the same basic depth. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Mara for a moment, then at the laundry on the line, then at the cabin, with the methodical attention of a man assessing inventory. "You'd be Mrs. Ellsworth," he said. "Not a question." "Who's asking?" Mara said. He produced a card from his breast pocket and held it out. She didn't walk toward him to take it, so he leaned down and set it on the fence rail. "Silas Vane, Collections Agent, Territorial District." She read those words and felt the cold in her stomach sharpen into something more specific. "I represent certain interests relating to the estate of Daniel Ellsworth," he said pleasantly. "You're a hard woman to locate, Mrs. Ellsworth. I've been looking for you for some weeks. My husband's estate was settled by the county court," Mara said. "His debts were discharged when they took the property." "Most of them," Silas said. "There are a few outstanding obligations that weren't captured in the county proceedings. Amounts borrowed from private parties." He produced a folded paper from the same pocket. "I have documentation." She didn't reach for it. "What amounts?" $470, he said. The number landed the way those numbers always land, not as information, but as a physical thing, something with weight. 400 and swindled dark. $470 was, in her present circumstances, approximately $470 more than she had in the world. "I don't believe my husband borrowed $470 from a private party," she said. "Mrs. Ellsworth, I understand this is difficult news." "I understand my husband's finances," she said, and hated that even now. Even saying it, she wasn't entirely sure that was true. Because Daniel had borrowed against the land twice without telling her. Because there had been debts she hadn't known about. And the part of her that knew, that was the same part that Silas Vane's shallow eyes were watching right now, looking for exactly that uncertainty, that crack. The document is signed and dated, he said. I'd be happy to give you time to review it. What I need is some indication that you intend to address the obligation. He paused. Or, alternatively, of course, an arrangement could be worked out. For a woman in your situation, there are options besides cash repayment. The way he said it was smooth enough that someone else might have missed it. Mara did not miss it. Get off this property, she said. Silas looked at her with those shallow eyes, and whatever had been performing pleasantness in them turned, not dramatically, but simply like a lamp being adjusted. I'll give you a few days to think it over, he said. I'm a reasonable man, Mrs. Ellsworth, but I'd encourage you not to test the limits of my reasonableness. He pulled the horse around and went back through the trees, unhurried. Dakara stood in the yard with the laundry, half hung, and her hands gone cold, and her mind running through every possibility and finding none of them good. She did not go inside immediately. She stood in the yard until she was sure she had her face right, because the girls were in the cabin and she was not going to walk in there with what was currently on her face. She had not told Rowan about Silas yet. She was working up to it. She was calculating the way she had calculated everything for 14 months. What information cost her to share? Who had the right to know what? What asking for help looked like versus what walking away looked like. Those calculations were deeply worn into her, and she didn't trust them as wisdom, but she couldn't yet figure out how to stop running them. Rowan found her that evening sitting on the porch after supper, and he sat down in the other chair. There were two old chairs on the porch, mismatched, both solid, and he didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat with her. The dark came in through the pines, and the creek made its noise to the east, and the light from the window behind them fell in a yellow rectangle on the porch boards. A man came today, she said after a while. He listened without interruption while she told him about Silas Vane. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she started to wonder what he was thinking, whether he was calculating what this woman and her problems were costing him, whether the reasonable accounting of the situation was about to show up in his face. His name's Silas Vane, he said. You know him? By reputation. He shifted in the chair, and she heard something in the brief silence that followed not surprise, but recognition. The sound of a man who has heard a name he was hoping not to hear. He's operated in 2 other counties I know of. Same method finds women who've lost husbands and property, produces documents that claim prior debt, and aren't alternatives to cash repayment, that aren't alternatives anyone should accept. Mara was quiet for a moment. He's done this before. He has. And the women he targets don't generally have the resources or the standing to fight him, Rowan said. Which is why he targets them. She heard this and felt something move in her not fear. She had already been afraid, but a different kind of cold. Cold of understanding something that has been happening to other people before it happened to you. Cold of a pattern. The debt isn't real, she said. Almost certainly not, Rowan said. But a forged document in front of the wrong judge is still a document. So what do I do? He looked at her, and in the dim light, from the window, she couldn't read his expression precisely, but she could read its quality, the quality of a man thinking rather than performing thinking, which was its own kind of reassurance. You let me go find out, he said. Rowan, not to fight someone, he said. To look. I know people in the county clerk's office. I know the judge who handles debt proceedings in this district, and I know what documentation he requires, and I know what a forged document looks like when you put it next to a real one. Let me go look, before you spend another night worrying about something that might be considerably smaller than it currently feels. She wanted to say she could handle it herself. That was the true thing, the deeply worn thing, the reflex. She had been handling things herself for so long that asking for help felt less like a choice and more like a surrender, like admitting that the 14 months had finally broken something she couldn't fix. But she thought about Silas Vane's shallow eyes. She thought about the way he'd looked at her laundry on the line, the quiet assessment of it, and she understood that she was not the first woman he had looked at that way, and that whatever had protected the women before her had not been sufficient. All right, she said. It was one word, and it cost her more than most things. Rowan left at first light the following morning without ceremony, which she appreciated. He told Tessa to listen to Mara, told Nell to eat her breakfast before it got cold, and was on his horse and gone through the trees before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. No promises about when he'd be back. No reassurances she'd have to hold on to and worry about dropping. Just gone, and the cabin carrying on without him the way a solid thing continues to stand. Tessa watched her for the first hour with the particular watchfulness of a child who has sensed something wrong and decided to monitor it rather than ask about it. Nell asked twice when Rowan was coming home and accepted both times without distress that Mara didn't know exactly. She kept the day going. She kept the girls busy with their letters and their chores, and a baking project that used more flour than it strictly should have, and produced cornbread that was good enough to be satisfying and lumpy enough to be honest. She did not sit and worry. She did not have the luxury, and besides, sitting and worrying had never in her life produced anything worth having. Silas Vane came back on the second day. She heard the horse on the trail, and this time she was ready, or as ready as a woman with no money and no legal standing and a forged debt against her name can be. She was standing on the porch when he came through the trees, and she had made sure to be standing, not sitting, because it matters where your feet are when someone arrives who is looking for weakness. Mrs. Ellsworth, he said. His pleasantness was back, reinstalled, but it fit less well today than it had the first time. I hope you've had time to consider your situation. I have, she said. And Rowan Thorne is in the county seat right now, she said. Talking to people who know what a real document looks like. Something moved behind Silas Vane's shallow eyes. It wasn't fear. She didn't think he was capable of the kind of fear ordinary people felt, but it was recalculation. The kind that happens when a situation has developed in a direction that wasn't planned for. Mr. Thorne has no legal standing in your debt proceedings, he said. No, she agreed. But he has a good memory and a lot of patience, and he knows the county clerk personally. She watched his face. How many women have you done this to? The pleasant expression stayed where it was, which was its own answer. I'd advise you to be careful about what you say publicly, Mrs. Ellsworth. Defamation has legal remedies. So does fraud, she said. The silence between them had a different quality now. She could feel it, the shift in the dynamic, the way something that had been tilted entirely in his direction was, with those two words, no longer entirely tilted. She didn't have proof yet. She didn't have anything except Rowan in the county seat and her own willingness to stand on this porch and say what she believed. But she was standing. That was the thing she hadn't fully understood. Somewhere in the past 3 weeks at the cabin, recovering by increments into the person she'd been before grief and humiliation had compressed her down to survival only. She had been so focused on the external conditions, the food and shelter and safety and dignity that Rowan had offered, and that she'd been so careful about accepting that she hadn't noticed the thing quietly happening inside her alongside all of it. She had stopped waiting for permission to take up space. Silas Vane looked at her for a long moment with those shallow water eyes. Then he pulled the horse around for the second time and went back through the trees. This time she noticed. He went a little faster. She stood on the porch until the sound of hooves was gone, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands, not in grief, but in the pure physical aftermath of holding herself together while something hard was happening. Her hands were shaking slightly. That was fine. Shaking afterward was fine. The thing was what happened while it was happening, and while it was happening, she had been upright. Nell came and leaned against her arm with the weight of a child who has decided this is what the situation requires. Was that the bad man? Nell asked. Mara lifted her head. How do you know about a bad man? Tessa said, someone bad came while Rowan was gone, and that you were handling it, Nell said, with absolute confidence in both parts of that sentence. Mara looked across the kitchen at Tessa, who was at the hearth, and not looking at her. Tessa, she said. Tessa turned. You were, she said, with a directness that didn't allow for argument. You were handling it. Mara looked at this 8-year-old child who had stood in a road in Blackthorn Crossing and refused to move, who had learned to count paces to the creek so she wouldn't get lost. Most of its windows were dark, who had covered her little sister with her body in an orphan institution and been found that way by a man who recognized what it meant. Yeah, Mara said I was. Rowan came back on the third evening with mud on his boots and a look on his face that Mara had learned to read as the expression of a man who has found exactly what he went looking for and is not pleased about what it was. He sat down at the table and waited until the girls were in bed and then he spread 3 documents on the table between them. He's been doing this for at least 4 years, Rowan said. 3 counties. At least 7 women I could confirm, probably more who didn't come forward. He touched the first document. This is the template he uses. It's sophisticated, looks official, right language, right stamps, except the notary seal he uses was revoked 2 years ago by the county clerk's office, and none of the dates on the contracts can be verified against any actual territorial records. He touched the second document. This is a signed statement from a woman in Carr County who will testify to what Silas Vane told her he'd do if she didn't comply with his arrangement. He didn't say what the arrangement was. He didn't need to. And this is a letter from Judge Harmon's office. He's been wanting to build a case against Vane for 8 months and hasn't had enough witnesses willing to come forward. Mara looked at the documents. She looked at Rowan's face. "You did all this in 3 days," she said. "I know the right people," he said, "and I had good reason to move fast." She looked at the letter from Judge Harmon's office. Her name was on it, not as defendant, as witness, as the woman whose testimony, added to the others, might be enough. She thought about Silas Vane coming back to the cabin, his shallow eyes, the quiet way he'd looked at her laundry. She thought about the women before her. 7 of them that Rowan could confirm. Probably more. "He'll come back," she said, "when he figures out what you've been doing." "He will," Rowan said. And Rowan looked at her across the table, and she thought about the first evening she'd sat on this porch with him, the way he'd said, "Let me go find out," without any performance attached to it. The way he had, in 3 days, turned an invisible man's invisible crimes into 3 pieces of paper on a kitchen table. "And we'll be ready," he said. Outside, the pines moved in the night wind. Inside, the lamp burned low, and the documents sat on the table between them, and the creek made its to the east like it had been making since long before any of this, and would be making long after. Mara put her hand flat on the letter with her name on it. She left it there. The hand she'd left flat on Judge Harmon's letter had still been there in her memory when she woke the next morning, and the morning after that, and the morning after that. Not as a dramatic gesture, she hadn't meant it as one, but as the physical fact of a decision being made. Like putting your foot down on ground you weren't sure would hold you. It held. For the next several days, the cabin operated in a state that Mara could only describe as armed normalcy. Everything that needed doing got done. The girls had their lessons. The garden got watered and weeded. Meals happened at the right times. Rowan worked the property, and she worked the household, and in the evenings they sat on the porch or at the kitchen table and talked through what they knew about Silas Vane, the way you'd talk through a problem that needed solving, not dramatically, not with the performed gravity of people in a crisis, but practically, which was its own kind of courage. She had sent a letter to Judge Harmon's office through Rowan, 3 pages in her careful hand, detailing every interaction with Silas Vane from the first visit to the second, including the specific language he'd used about alternatives to cash repayment. She had written it twice, once to get everything out and once to get it right. The second version was cleaner and harder and better. The version of a woman who knows that precision matters more than feeling when you're trying to build a case. Rowan read both versions because she asked him to, not to approve them, but to check that she hadn't missed anything legally significant. He suggested 3 additions. She made 2 of them and explained why she was leaving out in the third, and he considered her reasoning and said she was probably right. That exchanged the simple, functional quality of it. 2 people working on a problem together without one of them performing deference or the other performing authority stayed with her afterward. She rolled it over in her mind the way you roll a stone in your hand to understand its weight. She hadn't had a conversation like that in a very long time, maybe not since her mother died. And her mother had been the only person in her life who had ever treated her intelligence as a given rather than a pleasant surprise. What she didn't expect in all of it was Tessa. The girl had been quieter than usual since Silas Vane's second visit. Not withdrawn Tessa was not capable of actual withdrawal. She was too present for that, too occupied with observing the world around her, but quiet in the way that means processing rather than absence. She did her lessons and her chores, and ate her meals, and went to bed when she was supposed to. And she watched Mara with those measuring eyes and said less than she normally did, which was noticeable precisely because she normally said a great deal. Came out on a Thursday, after supper, When Nell had gone to bed early with a mild headache, and Mara was cleaning up, and Tessa was supposed to be reading but had set down her book. "Is the bad man going to come back with other men?" Tessa asked. Mara didn't look up from the dish she was washing. She had learned that Tessa asked her real questions better when the person she was asking wasn't looking directly at her. "Possibly," she said. "What happens then?" "Then we deal with it." "How?" "Carefully," Mara said. She set down the dish and picked up the next one. "Tessa, how much do you know about what's happening?" "Enough," Tessa said. "I know someone's trying to take you away, or make you go back to how things were before." A pause. "I won't let that happen." Mara did look up then. She couldn't help it. The girl was 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table with her book closed and her arms crossed and her jaw set in a way that was so completely Tessa that it almost made Mara smile, despite everything. "You stepped into that road in Blackthorn Crossing," Mara said. "Yes, that was very brave and very stupid, and I am grateful every day that it worked out." Tessa considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I know it was stupid," she said. "I did it anyway." "Why?" The question wasn't rhetorical. Mara genuinely wanted to know, had wanted to know since the beginning, since the moment she'd looked up in that road and seen 2 small girls standing between her and 3 men who had already decided how things were going to go. Tessa was quiet for a moment. "Because Rowan stepped in front of things for us," she said finally. "At the institution. There were people there who were mean to us, and Rowan stepped in front of it and took us away. So I know that that's something you can do. Step in front of things." She looked at Mara steadily. "And you looked like someone who needed it." Mara set down the dish she was holding before she dropped it. She turned around and looked at this child, this fierce, watchful, practical, impossible child, and felt something in her chest that was beyond naming, the particular emotion that has no word in English but that anyone who has ever been seen clearly by someone who had no obligation to look knows exactly. "Come here," she said. Tessa came, not with the rushing abandon of a child seeking comfort, but with the careful deliberateness of a child who has learned to approach affection like uncertain ground. Mara put her arms around her, and Tessa held still in them for a moment, and then incrementally leaned in. "Nobody's taking me anywhere," Mara said quietly, into the top of her head. "Not this time." Tessa didn't say anything, but her arms came up and she held on, and for a minute the kitchen was just that, a woman and a girl, and the smell of wood smoke and the creek to the east doing what creeks do. Silas Vane returned on a Tuesday, and he did not come alone. Mara saw from the east window, before they reached the yard, Silas on his gray horse, and 2 men behind him. Large men, the kind hired not for their thinking, but for what they communicated about the person who hired them. So the morning sun was behind them, so she couldn't see their faces clearly, but she could see enough. She went to the main room, where Rowan was working at the table, with papers from the county clerk's office. "He's here," she said. 3 of them. Rowan stood up. He didn't move fast, he never moved fast. She had noticed, except when fast was actually necessary, but he moved with the specific quality of a man, shifting from one mode to another, the way a piece of machinery engages. He took his rifle from above the door, which she had known was there, but had never seen him handle, and went out onto the porch. "Girls," Mara said. Tessa appeared from the back room with Nell behind her, and Mara looked at Tessa and said, without preamble, "Take Nell to the back room and stay there until I come get you. If I don't come in a reasonable time, go out the east window and go to the creek and wait." Tessa looked at her once, a long look, and then looked at the front door, and then looked back at Mara. "You're going out there?" "Yes." Tessa's jaw did the thing it did. "Okay," she said, and took Nell's hand and went. Mara picked up the document folio from the table, a leather case that Rowan had brought back from the county seat, which held the certified copies of Judge Harmon's correspondence and the notarized statements from the other witnesses, and the clerk's office memorandum on the revoked notary seal, and she went out onto the porch. Rowan was standing at the top of the steps, with the rifle in the crook of his arm, not raised, just present, which was doing its job simply by existing. The 3 horses had stopped at the edge of the yard. Silas Vane looked at the rifle, and then at Mara coming through the door, and something shifted in his expression, something that was managing a recalculation in real time. "Mr. Thorne," Silas said, "this is a private matter between myself and Mrs. Ellsworth. Your involvement is unnecessary and frankly inadvisable." Mrs. Ellsworth is on my property, Rowan said. That makes it my business. The law would disagree with that characterization. You'd need a lawyer to make that argument, Rowan said. You're welcome to go get one. Silas looked at Mara. The shallow eyes moved to the document folio in her hands and stayed there for a moment. She watched him look at it, and she watched him understand what it was, and that understanding moved across his face in a way that he couldn't fully control, which told her more than anything he might have said. Mrs. Ellsworth, he said, the pleasantness, reinstalled but thinner now, stretched over the frame of it. I have a legal obligation that I'm here to discharge. I'd encourage you to consider it carefully before you make it more complicated than it needs to be. My position, Mara said, is that I don't owe you money. Document. The notary seal on your document was revoked 2 years ago, she said. I have a memorandum from the county clerk's office to that effect. I also have correspondence from Judge Harmon, who has been building a case against you for 8 months and who has, as of last week, signed statements from 6 women in 3 counties who are prepared to testify. She held the folio up, not as a weapon, but as a fact. You picked the wrong woman this time. The silence that followed had a texture to it. The 2 men behind Silas shifted on their horses, and she could see them recalculating the situation the way hired men do when the situation has turned out to be more complicated than they were paid to handle. Whatever Silas had told them about this morning's errand, she was fairly certain it had not included county judges and signed statements. Silas Vane looked at her for a long time. She held his gaze. She did not look away, and she did not shift her weight, and she did not let her hands tighten on the folio, even though they wanted to. She had stood in a row in Blackthorn Crossing and let herself be dragged, because she had believed in that moment that fighting would only tighten the grip. She understood now that she had been half right about that sometimes fighting tightened the grip. But this was not a grip anymore. This was a man on a horse who had found himself on the wrong end of preparation. You'll regret this, Silas said. His voice had lost the pleasantness entirely now, and what was underneath it was smaller and colder than the performance had been. The voice of a man who is used to having the last word and can feel it slipping. Probably, Mara said, but not because of you. He pulled the gray horse around. He said something low to the 2 men that she didn't catch. And then the 3 horses went back through the trees, and the sound of them diminished through the pines and was gone. Rowan lowered the rifle. The yard was quiet. The morning sun had moved off the tree line and was hitting the kitchen garden and making the bean leaves look like green glass. Somewhere a bird was making its opinion known about something. Mara realized her legs were not entirely steady. She sat down on the porch step because sitting down was what was available, and she put the document folio across her knees and pressed her palms flat on it and breathed. Rowan sat down beside her, not close, just beside, and set the rifle across his thighs. That was the right thing to do, he said. I know, she said. My legs just haven't caught up yet. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. She felt it more than heard it. Rowan, she said. Why did you really come into that road? She hadn't asked him directly before. She'd asked around it, gathered information adjacent to it, understood the general shape of it. He'd seen Tessa step in front of something, and recognized something, and taken the girls, and built a life, and it had made a certain logical sense. But she meant something more specific now. She meant the particular moment. The precise Tuesday morning when he had been in Blackthorn Crossing. For whatever reason he'd been there, and had seen a woman being dragged through the dirt, and decided that was something he was going to do something about. Rowan was quiet, long enough that the bird finished its editorial and moved on. I've been that woman, he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the yard, at the place where Silas Vane's horse had stood, and his profile had the quality it sometimes got. In the evenings not closed, exactly. But like a door that's neither locked nor fully open, just resting. Not literally, he said. But there was a time when I was small, I suppose. Before all of this, he gestured vaguely at the cabin, the land, the life. I grew up in an industrial institution myself. Not the same one as the girls. Different one. Worse one, I think, though I don't have much basis for comparison. He paused. When I was about 15, the man who ran it decided I had a debt to him. For my board, my keep, years of it going back to when I was 5. He produced a document. Very official looking. Mara said nothing. I sat, Rowan said, because I was 15 and I didn't know what I was signing, and nobody had ever told me I could refuse. He looked at his hands. Spent 3 years working off a debt that was never real. By the time I got out of there, I had developed a particular feeling about men who produce documents. He said it so plainly, without any architecture of drama around it, that it landed harder than it would have with decoration. I'm sorry, Mara said. Long time ago, he looked back at the yard. But when I sees that thing, the production of a document, the performance of legal weight, aimed at someone who doesn't know they can question it, I have trouble walking past it. He paused, and Tessa had already stepped into the road. They sat in the quiet for another minute. Told me why she did that, Mara said. Last week. She said you'd stepped in front of things for them, and she knew it was something you could do. Something moved in Rowan's face briefly, before it settled back into its usual steadiness. She told you that, word for word. He was quiet. Then she's something, that girl. She really is, Mara said. The weeks following Silas Vane's last visit moved with a kind of deliberate momentum, the way things move when actions are in motion that you can't speed up and can only wait on. Rowan had sent word to Judge Harmon's office about the confrontation in the yard, the date, the specific threats, the witnesses present, and the judge's clerk had replied that this would be added to the file and that proceedings against Vane were expected to move forward within the month. Mara didn't wait passively. Waiting passively was not in her nature, and the weeks at the cabin had given that nature back to her, enough that she could feel it operating again, the engine of her, the capability, turning over and running. She wrote to 3 women. The names had come from Rowan's trip to the county seat, the women in 3 counties who had given statements to Judge Harmon's office. She wrote to them in her careful hand, not to ask anything of them, but simply to say that she understood something of what they'd been through, and that she was there if they needed to be written back to, and that none of them had done anything to deserve what had been done to them. She signed each letter with her full name and the address of the cabin. 2 of them wrote back. The first was a woman named Clara Briggs from Carr County, who had been in Silas Vane's sights for 6 months, and had eventually paid him $112 she'd borrowed from her brother-in-law because she'd been too frightened to fight and too ashamed to tell anyone why. She wrote in short sentences, and her handwriting was uneven in a way that suggested she'd learned it late in life. She said receiving Mara's letter was the first time in 8 months she'd told a stranger what happened and not been treated like it was somehow her fault. Mara read that sentence twice. Mara read that sent twice, and then put the letter down and went outside and walked to the creek, which was 412 paces from the cabin. If you step normal, and she stood at the water's edge for a few minutes and looked at the way it moved over the rocks, unhurried, going where it was going, and she thought about all the things she should have been angry about a long time ago and hadn't had the resources to be angry about, because survival had been taking up all the available space. She went back to the cabin and wrote Clara Briggs a second letter, longer this time, that contained, among other things, the information about Judge Harmon and the specific steps for supplementing an existing statement if Clara wanted to add the detail about the $112. The second letter was from a woman named Ruth Abernathy, who was 61 years old and had been widowed twice and had a way of writing that was as dry and precise as a legal document and made Mara like her immediately. Ruth said she had already given a statement and was prepared to travel to testify in person if required, and had been prepared since the first month and was, if Mara would forgive her directness, wondering what was taking so long. Mara wrote back, suggesting they might enjoy meeting each other someday. Ruth wrote back, saying she agreed and asked if Mara played cards. In the midst of all of this, in the specific texture of those days, the letters, the waiting, the girls, the cabin, the steady accumulation of a life being rebuilt, something else was happening that Mara was less equipped to examine directly. Something between her and Rowan that had been developing with the unhurried logic of things that build, because they're built on something real, rather than because anyone decided to build them. It was not simple. She would have mistrusted it if it had been. She was 29 years old and had been a wife and had spent 14 months being systematically reduced to nothing by a community that should have known better, and none of that had left her particularly inclined to trust new things easily, especially this kind of new thing. But Rowan Thorne was not an easy man or a simple one, and he was not offering something simple. He was offering she thought about this carefully. The way she'd thought carefully about the document folio and the letters and the things worth trusting, he was offering consistency, which was different from promises. Consistency was verifiable. You could check it against itself. He was the same in the morning as in the evening. He was the same when something went wrong, when the axle on the wagon cracked in October, and the cost of repairing it meant a lean few weeks as he was when something went right. He did not perform patience with the girls. He had it. He did not perform respect for her. He had it. When he disagreed with her about something, which happened with reasonable regularity, because they were two people with opinions, he said so directly and without theater, and when she disagreed back, he listened rather than managed her. She found herself watching him without meaning to. Not romantically, not at first, practically, the way you watch something you're trying to understand. She watched the way he spoke to the girls, the specific quality of his attention when Tessa was explaining something. At length, the way he always answered Nell's questions like they were real questions rather than small person noise. She watched the way he worked steadily, without complaint but also without false cheerfulness. The honesty of a man who knows that hard things are hard and sees no point in pretending otherwise. She watched him. One evening carry a drowsy Nell from the chair where she'd fallen asleep to her bed, and the way he did it, the careful automatic tenderness of it, the way he shifted her weight so her head stayed comfortable without waking her, and she thought, oh, and then she thought, not yet, not now. There's too much still unresolved, and I'm not going to be the kind of woman who confuses gratitude for something else. She tucked that thought away and let it sit where it needed to sit. Then November came in cold and gray, and everything moved very fast. The message from Judge Harmon's office arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by a writer from the county seat, who also brought a letter from Ruth Abernathy, that Mara only got to read 2 days later, because the judge's message required immediate attention. The message said that proceedings against Silas Vane were scheduled for the following Friday, that Mara's testimony was requested in person, that the clerk's office would arrange accommodation for any witnesses traveling from distance, and that the judge's expectation was that this matter would be resolved completely. Rowan read the message with her and then looked up and said, 5 days. 5 days, she agreed. Are you ready? She thought about the road in Blackthorn Crossing, about Buck Harlan's hand in her hair, about Silas Vane's shallow water eyes and the way he'd looked at her laundry, and the practiced performance of pleasantness that he'd turned on and off like a lamp. She thought about Clara Briggs borrowing $112 from her brother-in-law and being too ashamed to tell anyone why. She thought about Ruth Abernathy, 61 years old and twice widowed and already packed and ready to go. Yes, she said, and meant it. What she hadn't expected was the letter that arrived the following Wednesday, one day before they were to leave for the county seat. It came with the regular postwriter and was addressed to her in a handwriting she didn't recognize, and it was from Blackthorn Crossing. She stared at the return address for a moment before she opened it. It was from Hector Pruitt, Hector, who had let her sleep behind his store and then looked above her head when she was being dragged. Hector, who had said nothing and done nothing, and gone back inside his dry goods store and had his dinner and slept in his bed and told himself, probably, that it was none of his business. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The handwriting was the handwriting of a man who doesn't write often enough to be fluid at it, uneven and slightly cramped. He said he had heard from the Vane proceedings and understood Mara would be testifying. He said he was ashamed of himself. He said that was not sufficient. He knew, but he wanted her to have it in writing, so she could do whatever she wanted with it. He said that some peoples in town were having a gathering in December, and that if she ever wanted to come back, even briefly, she would be welcome. Not as an apology from the town, he was careful about that, specific in a way that she appreciated, but because some of them wanted the chance to do something different with their faces when they saw her. She read it twice, standing at the window with the morning light coming through the glass. She was not moved to forgiveness, exactly. She wasn't sure forgiveness was the right category for what Hector Pruitt had done, which was less an act than a failure to act, which was the quieter kind of wrong and in some ways harder to assign a response to. But she was moved by the specificity of his shame, by the fact that he'd been exact about it, not asking her for anything, not performing contrition for the purpose of feeling better, just naming it and leaving it with her to do what she wanted. She put the letter in the document folio with everything else. The ride to the county seat took most of Thursday, and Mara sat in the wagon with the girls while Rowan drove, and the pines gave way to open country, and the open country went gray-gold with late autumn. And Tessa asked questions about what a courthouse looked like, and Nell fell asleep against Mara's arm, and the miles went by. They stayed at the accommodation the clerk's office had arranged, a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Fulton, who was brisk and efficient, and fed them a hot supper, and made up beds without asking unnecessary questions. Ruth Abernathy was already there when they arrived, sitting at the supper table with a cup of coffee and an expression that assessed them both and apparently found them satisfactory. "Mrs. Ellsworth," she said, "you're taller than I expected from your letters." "Mrs. Abernathy," Mara said, "you're exactly what I expected from your letters." Ruth's mouth did something that might, in a more expressive face, have been a smile. "Sit down and have some coffee. We have things to discuss." They talked until nearly midnight, Ruth and Mara and Rowan with Mrs. Fulton refilling the coffee pot twice, and the girls asleep upstairs. Ruth had more information about Silas Vane's methods than anyone else they'd spoken to. She had spent 8 months methodically gathering it, the way she apparently did everything, with the thoroughness of a woman who had decided that if she was going to do something, she was going to do it completely. She knew which counties he'd operated in and in which order. She knew the name of the man who made his forged seals. She knew that he had a partner, a lawyer in the territorial capital, who reviewed his contracts and provided just enough legal surface texture to make them look credible under casual examination. "The lawyer is the key," Ruth said. "Vane is a foot soldier, unpleasant, effective, but replaceable. The lawyer is the architecture." Rowan leaned forward. "Can you prove the connection?" "I can show that the lawyer's formatting appears in every contract across every county," Ruth said. "Whether Judge Harmon can build enough from that is his problem. Mine was getting it here." She produced a folder from the bag beside her chair. Thick, methodical, organized in a way that made Mara's own document folio look preliminary. Mara looked at this woman, 61 years old, twice widowed, steady as a fence post, with those precise, dry eyes that had apparently spent 8 months quietly, building a case that no one had asked her to build, and felt something she could only describe as recognition. Not of shared experience, exactly. Their lives had been different in almost every particular, but of a quality. Of a way of meeting the world that said, "You're going to do this to me, and so I am going to do this about it, and I am going to do it right." "Ruth," she said, "I'm very glad you wrote back." Ruth looked at her. "I'm very glad you wrote," she said, and that was all, which was enough. The courthouse was a solid brick building on the main street of the county seat, 2 stories, with the slightly solemn quality of buildings designed to hold consequential proceedings. They arrived Friday morning in a group, Mara and Rowan and Ruth Abernathy, and 2 other women who had traveled overnight from Carr County with a shared wagon and a shared expression of determined composure. Clara Briggs was one of them. She was smaller than Mara had imagined, from the short sentences of her letters, with red hair going gray at the temples and hands that stayed clasped together the way hands do when they need something to do. "You're Mara," Clara said, immediately, in the courthouse yard. "I am," Mara said. "You're Clara." Clara looked at her for a moment with the specific quality of a woman looking at the person whose letter had made her feel, for the first time in 8 months, like something other than a victim. "Thank you," she said, "for writing. Thank you for writing back." Clara looked at the courthouse. Her hands tightened briefly. "I've never done anything like this." "Neither have I," Mara said. "Think we do it anyway." Clara nodded. Her hands loosened slightly. They went inside. The proceedings took the better part of the day. Judge Harmon was a lean man of about 60, with the specific brand of patience that belongs to people who have presided over human difficulty for long enough that they've stopped being surprised by it, but haven't stopped taking it seriously. He moved methodically through the documentation, the statements, the testimony. He asked precise questions and listened to the complete answers. He did not rush, and he did not perform. Mara testified for about 40 minutes. She had written her statement out and read it aloud, which she'd chosen deliberately. She knew she was steadier on paper than spoken, knew that her voice might not hold for everything she needed to say, and she wasn't going to let her voice be the thing that broke the argument. She read it clearly and completely. including the section about what Silas Vane had implied about alternative arrangements, and she looked at Vane's lawyer, a heavy man with careful eyes, who had arrived with the specific composure of someone who has faced uncomfortable proceedings before, and she did not look away from him until she was done. Silas Vane, when it was his turn, produced arguments that were professional and hollow. His lawyer was better than he was, built a reasonable sounding case for ambiguity, for misfiled documents and administrative error, and the complexities of territorial record-keeping. Then Ruth Abernathy testified. Ruth testified for an hour and 20 minutes, from her folder, in a voice that never varied in pace or volume, and that laid out, with the patience of someone who has all the time in the world and all the information she needs, precise connections between Silas Vane's operations across 3 counties and the lawyer sitting beside him. She quoted dates, document numbers, the specific formatting quirks that appeared in every forged contract. She named the revoked notary seal and the date it was revoked, and the name of the clerk who had processed the revocation. She named the man who made the seals and the county he operated from. She produced, from the back of her folder, a signed affidavit from that man, which she handed to the judge's clerk without commentary. The lawyer's careful eyes were less careful by the time Ruth sat down. Judge Harmon adjourned for 2 hours. The 6 women who had testified sat in the courthouse hallway on a wooden bench and didn't talk much, which was fine because they had each already said the important things in that courtroom. Clara Briggs sat beside Mara, with her hands in her lap and her eyes on the floor. Most of its windows, Mara sat with her shoulder against Clara's and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to say that the sitting wasn't already saying. Rowan waited outside in the courthouse yard with a patience that was one of the things she had come to understand was genuinely his, not performed, not forced, just the settled quality of a man who has made his peace with the reality that some things cannot be hurried and that hurrying them does not, in fact, hurry them. When the judge returned and read his determination's fraud established, proceedings referred to territorial authorities for criminal charges, all claimed debts against the named women void and unenforceable, the connected attorney referred to the territorial bar for investigation. Mara heard it the way you hear things that you've been working toward for long enough that the arrival of them feels slightly unreal. Like a door you've been pushing against for so long that, when it finally opens, you stumble forward a little before you can stand straight. Clara Briggs let out a breath beside her that sounded like it had been held for about 8 months. Ruth Abernathy closed her folder and put it in her bag with the deliberate satisfaction of a person completing a task that was always going to get done. Mara looked at the ceiling of the courthouse at the pressed tin panels, ordinary and functional and not particularly beautiful, and thought about the road in Blackthorn Crossing, about the particular quality of being dragged in the dirt while 30 people stood at the edges of the road and watched, about 2 little girls stepping into that road, about a hand held out without conditions that she had been frightened enough and tired enough and finally brave enough to take. She thought about what it had cost her to take that hand. The calculation on the stump in the yard that first evening, the constant low-grade checking and rechecking of what things cost and what they meant and what they would require. She thought about how long it had taken her to stop running that calculation every time Rowan handed her something that wasn't a trap. Most of its windows dark, she thought about all the women who had come before her in Silas Vane's ledger, the ones Ruth had found, and the ones who hadn't been found, and the ones who had simply absorbed what happened to them because there was no one to tell. She walked out of that courthouse into the autumn afternoon and found Rowan in the yard, and she told him what the judge had said, and he listened, and when she was done, he said simply, "Good," with the weight of a word that means more than it contains. Clara Briggs came out behind her and stood in the courthouse yard and looked at the street and the sky with the expression of someone re-entering the world after a long time in a place where the world wasn't available. "What do you do now?" Mara asked her. Clara considered this for a moment. "Go home," she said. "Pay my brother-in-law back, which I've been doing by increments anyway." She paused. "Try to feel like myself again, whatever that means." "It means something different than it used to," Mara said. "At least it did for me." Clara looked at her. Different good or different bad? Mara thought about the cabin, the kitchen garden along the south wall, the document folio, Nell's drawing folded on the wooden crate, Tessa's voice saying someone has to step in front of things, Rowan at the kitchen table with papers and the steady quality of his attention. Different, she said. Just different. Clara nodded slowly, like someone filing something away. They stood for a moment in the autumn light that came down clean and cold between the buildings, and then Lara, companion from Carr County, appeared at her elbow and said the wagon was ready. And Clara looked at Mara once more. "I'm glad you wrote," she said again. Mara watched her go. She turned around and found Tessa at her elbow, appearing as Tessa appeared without announcement, simply present, having apparently decided that the courthouse steps were now an appropriate place to be. "Done?" Tessa asked. "The first part of it," Mara said. Tessa processed this. "What's the second part?" Mara looked at Hector Pruitt's letter, which she'd been carrying folded in the inner pocket of her coat since the morning she'd put it there. She could feel the edges of it against her ribs. "I'm not sure yet," she said, "but I'm thinking about it." Tessa accepted this and slipped her hand into Mara's, and they stood in the courthouse yard, in the last of the afternoon light, and the county seat went on around them doing what towns do, small east of the mountains. Blackthorn Crossing was doing what it did, and in a cabin 3 miles into the pine country, there was a kitchen garden along the south wall, and a rope bed with a cedar-scented blanket and a drawing of a family that had a space in it for a cat they didn't have yet. Mara folded her hand around Tessa's and held on. The ride back from the county seat took all of the following morning, and part of the afternoon, and Mara spent most of it not talking, which Rowan seemed to understand without being told, and which the girls, to their credit, eventually respected, after Tessa asked 3 questions in the first hour and received sufficiently brief answers that she concluded Mara needed the quiet and shifted her attention to the passing landscape instead. It wasn't grief exactly what Mara was sitting with. It wasn't relief either. Though there was relief in it, the particular thin kind that comes when something you've been braced against finally stops pressing. What it mostly was, she thought, watching the open country give way gradually back to pine, was the feeling of a story reaching a point she hadn't known it was going to reach. She had spent so long focused on the immediate, on surviving, then on Silas Vane, then on the courthouse, that she hadn't given much thought to what came after the courthouse. It felt like a luxury she hadn't been able to afford. Now, apparently, she could afford it. The cabin looked the same when they came through the trees, which she found disproportionately reassuring. The same lopsided porch, the same kitchen garden dormant. Now with the cold coming, the beanstalks pulled and the ground turned for winter. The same creek to the east that she could hear before she could see. It was just a cabin. She had lived in considerably nicer houses, but she had not, in her adult life, lived anywhere that felt the way this place felt when she came back to it, and she was honest enough with herself, on this particular afternoon, to stop pretending she didn't know what that meant. She helped Nell down from the wagon, and Nell immediately announced that she needed to check on the rock she'd left by the porch, which was a specific rock she had designated as important for reasons that had never been fully explained and that everyone had learned not to question. Tessa jumped down herself and went to help Rowan with the horse, because Tessa always helped with the horse, had decided months ago that the horse was partially her responsibility, and nobody had seen any reason to argue. Mara went up the porch steps and stood in the doorway of the cabin for a moment before she went in. The kitchen was exactly as they'd left it. The lamp was where it always was. The mending basket was on the left side of the hearth. Nell's drawing was in her room on the wooden crate, the 5 figures in a row with the future cat at the end. She went in and started the stove. She did not take Hector Pruitt's letter out of her coat pocket that evening. Cooked something they ate, and the girls went to bed, and she and Rowan sat on the porch in the cold with the last of the day fading, and she did not take the letter out. She had been thinking about it for 3 days, and she needed a little more time with it before she handed it to someone else's eyes. "Hector Pruitt wrote to me," she said eventually. Rowan looked at her from the other chair. "The dry goods man. He let me sleep behind his store. And then he looked above my head when Buck Harlan had me in the road." She said it without particular heat. It was a fact, not an accusation, and it belonged to a time that felt further away than it actually was. He wrote to say he's ashamed of himself, and that some people in Blackthorn Crossing are having a gathering in December, and I'd be welcome. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do with that?" The question, as usual, was exactly the right one. Not what did she think she should do, or what did he think she should do, Or what was the practical or prudent or healing response? What did she want? I don't know yet, she said. I've been turning it around. Take your time with it. I am. She watched the last light leave the sky between the pines. I know I'm not going back for an apology. I don't need one. I've decided that. What would you go back for? She thought about this carefully, the way she'd thought about the documents and the letters. To be seen, she said, as what I am now. Not because I need them to tell me what I am, I don't. Not anymore. But there's something, she stopped, reaching for the exact language. There's something about the place where they tried to erase you, about standing in it again and being visible, not triumphant, not forgiving, just visible. Rowan didn't say anything for a moment. Then, I think that's a good reason to go. She looked at him. You'd come. It was not a question, and she recognized, when she heard herself say it, that this was new, that several months ago she would not have said it that way, would have framed it as a request or an imposition or a negotiation. Now she simply said it, because she knew he would, and she knew he would because she had been paying attention. Yes, he said, and the girls will want to come. Tessa will insist on it, Mara agreed. Nell will wear her good dress and take the rock, Rowan said, which was so accurate that Mara laughed a real laugh, the kind that comes without warning from somewhere genuine, and its windows were dark, and it surprised her a little because she hadn't heard herself do that in so long that the sound of it felt like meeting someone she used to know. Rowan looked at her when she laughed, not intrusively, just registering, the way he registered things. She stopped laughing and the night was quiet again, and she felt the particular quality of the moment between them, the one she'd been carrying in a folded place, since the evening she'd watched him carry Nell to bed, and she thought, not yet, still not yet, there is still too much being sorted. And she put it back in the folded place and looked at the trees. December arrived in Blackthorn Crossing with the kind of cold that made everything very specific, and still, the mountains standing out hard and clean against a sky that had gone deep winter blue and didn't apologize for it. Mara wore the dress she had made from cloth. Rowan had brought back from one of his supply runs to the county seat dark green wool, simply cut, nothing decorative about it except that she had made it herself, and the seams were straight and the fit was right, which for her was decoration enough. She had not told anyone they were coming. Hector Pruitt's letter had described the gathering as the kind of thing that happened in Blackthorn, crossing every December supper at the community hall, people bringing food, the general milling of a small community that has been cooped up by cold, and is looking for an occasion. She had not sent word that she would be there. She had decided she didn't want to be prepared for. The value of going, she had concluded, was in arriving as herself, without advance notice, without the performance that advance notice would require on both sides. The wagon rolled into Blackthorn Crossing at 4:30 in the afternoon. Nell was in her good dress, which was blue calico and had a tear at the hem that Mara had mended with thread that was a slightly different shade of blue and that Nell didn't mind, because Mara had told her honestly that the thread wasn't a perfect match, and Nell had said that was fine, she liked it. Tessa had her hair in braids that she'd done herself and refused assistance with, which meant they were slightly uneven, and she knew it and didn't care. Mara sat in the wagon as they came down the main street of Blackthorn Crossing, and she looked at the road she had been dragged through. It was just a road. In winter it looked harder and more honest than it had. In summer the mud frozen, the wheel ruts preserved in ice, the boardwalks empty in the cold afternoon. The livery stable at the north end where Buck Harlan worked, the dry goods store where Hector Pruitt had let her sleep behind it, and then looked above her head. The boarding house where Mrs. Calloway had not paid her for a week's work, the church where Reverend Cole had suggested she consider moving on, with all the gentleness of someone who had already decided. She looked at all of it. It did not make her chest cave in, which was what she had been quietly checking for the test, of whether she had actually moved past this, or was simply telling herself she had. What she felt was something more complex and less dramatic than either grief or triumph. It was the feeling of looking at a place where something happened to you and recognizing that it is a place, just a place, and that the thing it did to you was real, and the recovery from it was real, and neither fact cancels the other out. There's a lot of people, Nell observed, watching the community hall at the center of town, where light showed through the windows and the sound of voices carried even in the cold. It's a gathering, Tessa said, with the authority of someone explaining something she also only just learned. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop at the rail and climbed down and tied the horse, and then he turned and held out his hand to help Mara down, and she took it. Most of its windows were dark, and they stood in the street in front of the community hall, with the cold air and the sounds from inside and the frozen ruts in the road, and she looked at him. He looked back. His eyes were gray in the winter light, and his face had its usual quality, steady, present, not performing anything. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, which was like she was real and worth looking at, and she thought, if I could be sure of anything in this world, I think I could be sure of that. They went in. The community hall was warm and close and smelled of wood smoke and pine boughs and whatever was cooking in the kitchen at the back, and it took about 15 seconds for the room to register their presence. Not loudly, there was no dramatic hush, no theatrical pause. Just the incremental awareness that ripples through a room when something unexpected walks through the door, a quality of attention shifting. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment and let it happen. She saw Hector Pruitt first because he was closest to the door, and something happened in his face that was more complicated than shame and more honest than relief. He was a middle-aged man who had been a decent person in most of his life and had failed at a specific moment and knew it and had written a letter about it because he didn't know what else to do. Mrs. Ellsworth, he said. Mr. Pruitt, she said. They looked at each other for a moment. It was not a reconciliation. It was too early and too real for that word. But it was two people acknowledging something that had happened and both of them being present for that acknowledgement, which was more than she'd expected when she decided to come. I'm glad you're here, he said. Careful, like he meant it to land right, rather than just to land. I know, she said. She moved into the room. Mrs. Calloway was there, near the back wall, and she looked at Mara with an expression that could not quite decide what to do with itself. Mara met her eyes and held them for a moment, not challenging, not forgiving, just holding in misses. Calloway looked down first, which was its own kind of answer. Reverend Cole was not there. She noticed this and noted it and moved on. There were people she didn't recognize, which made sense. Blackthorn Crossing had been growing, and she'd been gone the better part of a year, and not everyone in a room has a history with you. Some of these people simply saw a green wool dress coming through the door with two girls and a quiet man and took her at current face value, which was all she wanted from strangers. Tessa navigated the room with the focused purposefulness of a child on reconnaissance. Nell stayed close to Mara for the first 10 minutes, and then located a group of children near the back and drifted toward them with the social confidence of someone who has decided people are probably fine until proven otherwise. A woman Mara didn't recognize came up to her near the food table, 40 or so, with the direct manner of someone who hasn't lived long enough in Blackthorn Crossing to have been present for the history. I don't think we've met, the woman said. I'm Frances Dole. My husband and I came out from Ohio in the spring. Mara Ellsworth, Mara said. Oh, Frances said, with a quality in her voice that indicated she had heard the name, but in a different version than she was now looking at. She recalibrated visibly and graciously. You know, a few people told me about you. What happened? I just want you to know I think what those men did was, she seemed to run out of words adequate to what she thought it was. Well, I'm glad you're here now. Thank you, Mara says, and meant it. That was how most of it went. Not dramatically. Not with the charged weight of a scene that knows it's a scene. People, one by one, doing the small thing or the medium thing or occasionally the wrong thing, and Mara moving through it the way you move through weather, taking what came, staying on her feet. Buck Harlan was there. She had wondered if he would be and had decided, in the deciding to come, that she could manage it either way. He was at the far side of the room when she first saw him, with Clem Dozer beside him, and both of them had seen her at the same moment she saw them, and what moved across Buck Harlan's face was something she didn't have a name for, not remorse. She didn't think Buck Harlan had the internal architecture for remorse, but something like the uncomfortable awareness of a man who is used to being right about things and has found out he was wrong about one. He did not come over to her. She did not go over to him. They existed in the same room for 2 hours and kept to their respective sides of it, and that was the arrangement, and it was fine. She did not need a scene from Buck Harlan. She did not need his acknowledgement or his apology or his understanding of what he'd done. What she needed, she had already gotten, which was to stand in this room where she had been erased and not be erased. Most of its windows were dark. It was Rowan who had the interaction with Buck toward the end of the evening, and she only heard about it afterward. She'd been in the kitchen at the back helping bring out more coffee, and when she came back, Rowan was standing near the door with an expression of someone who has said everything that needed saying in the minimum number of words. "What did he say to you?" she asked. When they were back in the wagon headed home, with the girls wrapped in blankets in the back and the cold stars overhead. "He said I had no business interfering in town matters," Rowan said. "Back in the summer, when I was in the road." "What did you say?" "I said he was right technically, and I'd do it again." She sat with this for a moment. And he walked away," Rowan said, which was the correct choice. She laughed again, the same kind she'd laughed on the porch unplanned, from somewhere real, and Tessa's voice came from under the blankets in the back. "What's funny?" something Rowan said. "He's not usually funny," Tessa said, with the bluntness of a child who loves someone, and therefore doesn't feel the need to be diplomatic about their qualities. "I have my moments," Rowan said. "Name one," Tessa said. "Right now," Rowan said. "You're under a blanket arguing about whether I'm funny." "That's fairly funny." There was a pause from under the blanket. "That's barely funny," Tessa said, but she didn't sound unhappy about it. Nell said nothing, having apparently fallen asleep somewhere in the argument, which was also fairly funny. Mara sat in the wagon with the cold coming down from the mountains, and the stars doing what they always did, and the pines coming back up around the road, and she felt the particular satisfaction of something completed, not resolved, not healed. Those words were too clean for what it actually was, but completed. She had stood in Blackthorn Cross in a dress she'd made herself, and had been looked at by the people who had watched her be erased, and she had not been erased, and that was the thing she'd gone for, and she had it. She could move forward now. What moving forward looked like in the weeks after Blackthorn Crossing was a question she let herself begin to answer. The first answer was small. She wrote back to Ruth Abernathy. Proposing they meet somewhere between their respective locations, and Ruth wrote back suggesting a Tuesday in January and the boarding house in Carr County, What Truth, where she knew the proprietor and the coffee was adequate. Mara went, leaving the girls with Rowan for 2 days, which she'd never done before, and which Tessa accepted with equanimity. And Nell accepted by making Mara promise to bring something back from the journey, the specific nature of the something left open. She brought Nell a piece of rose quartz from a creek bank near Carr County that caught the light in a way that Nell immediately decided was exactly what she had wanted, without knowing what she was waiting for. Ruth was in person, exactly what her letters had promised. She was brisk and capable and funny in the deadpan way of someone who has seen enough of the world to find most of it absurd. She had opinions about everything, and was not shy about them, and listened genuinely when Mara had opinions back, which Mara did, and the two of them ate supper, and then sat by the boarding house fire for 3 hours. In a conversation that Mara could only describe, riding home the following day, as the most honest conversation she had had with another woman in years. Ruth had been thinking, she said, about what to do with the rest of her experience. She was 61 years old and had been through things and had built, over those 8 months of researching Silas Vane, something she hadn't expected to build, competence in a specific area. She knew how to identify fraudulent debt documentation. She knew the territorial laws that governed debt proceedings and the specific vulnerabilities that men like Vane exploited. She knew which judges were worth approaching and how to approach them. She knew what women who had been through this needed to hear and what they didn't. "I've been thinking," Ruth said, "about what would have helped me when it was happening. Before I knew what I was doing," she turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I would have wanted someone to tell me I wasn't alone and also tell me specifically what my rights were. Not just sympathy." "Infirmess," Mara said. "Exactly that. You're thinking about something," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. Mara had been thinking about something. She'd been thinking about it since the courthouse yard, since Clara Briggs saying she was glad Mara wrote, since the ride home, and the cabin and the winter settling in around the pine country. She'd been thinking about Hector Pruitt's letter and the gathering, and what it felt like to stand in a room where you'd been erased and not be erased. She'd been thinking about the thing Tessa had said, someone has to step in front of things, and the particular way that applied to more than one road in more than one town. I have money coming, Mara said. She said this carefully because it still felt strange to say a fact she'd been in possession of for several weeks and hadn't quite incorporated. My late husband had a family in Missouri. His brother wrote to me. I think the brother's been carrying some guilt about not taking me in after Daniel died, because the letter was careful, very carefully worded. She paused. There's an inheritance, a modest one, from Daniel's mother's estate. It came through the legal proceedings in Missouri, and apparently there was something that belonged to me that had been in probate. Not a large amount, but she stopped. Enough. Ruth was watching her. Enough for what? I have land in mind, Mara said, near Blackthorn Crossing. Not in it, near it. There's a piece along the lower road that I've been thinking about for a while. She had been thinking about it, she realized, without knowing she was thinking about it, the way you think about things that are still becoming clear. I want to build something. Not just a house. A place where women can come when they have nowhere else to go. Work. While they're there, I don't mean charity in the way that strips dignity. I mean a place with structure and purpose, where they can get their feet back under them. She looked at Ruth, where someone can explain to them what the actual law says about their debts. Ruth was quiet for long enough that Mara felt the particular vulnerability of having said something you've been keeping to yourself for too long. You need a lawyer, Ruth said, or someone who knows enough law to be useful without the expense. I need a lot of things, Mara said. I'm working out the order. Ruth looked at her with those precise dry eyes. I have time, she said simply, and I have 8 months of notes. She reached across the table, and they shook hands, which was Ruth's way of doing things, and it was the right way for this. Mara went home and told Rowan. She told him on the porch, which had become the place where the real conversations happened, and she told him the whole of it, the money from Missouri, the land she had in mind, what she wanted to build on it, Ruth Abernathy and her 8 months of notes and her readiness to be useful. She told him clearly and completely and watched his face while she did. He listened the same way he always listened. With the quality she had come to understand was not just patience, but genuine attention, the kind that actually receives rather than just waits for its turn. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. The piece along the lower road, he said. Past the mill? Yes, I know that piece. It's good land. Creek access. South-facing slope. You'd need to build. Not just a house, a structure that could hold multiple families. I know. That's a significant project. I know, she said. I'm not afraid of significant projects. He looked at her with something she was by now familiar enough with to name, even if naming it still felt like handling something carefully. No, he said, you're not. He said it, simply the way he said things he meant without embellishment. I can build, I know you can. Then we build, he said. She looked at him. The winter dark was coming down through the pines, and the creek was making its noise to the east, and she felt the warmth of the cabin at her back and heard faintly the sound of Nell singing something to her inside, which Nell did, sometimes when she thought no one was paying attention, a wandering, unconscious melody that had no particular tune but sounded like contentment. Rowan, she said. She had been keeping something in a folded place for months. She had checked on it periodically and found it unchanged, which had told her what she needed to know. She had waited because she'd wanted to be sure that what it was what it appeared to be, that she wasn't confusing rescue for love, or safety for love, or the absence of danger for the presence of something real. She was sure now. She had been sure for a while. I need to say something to you, she said. He turned to look at her. I came to this place with nothing except the certainty that taking anything from anyone had a cost attached to it. She said it carefully, the way she'd learned to say important things. I spent a long time waiting for your cost to show up. The condition underneath the help, the thing you actually wanted, he said. It never showed up. No, that's not something I've had much experience with, she said, from anyone. And I don't know how to say this without it sounding like less than it is, so I'm just going to say it plainly. She looked at him. I love you. I have for a while. I'm not confused about whether that's gratitude or something else. It's not gratitude. This is just what it is. Porch was quiet. The creek to the east. The pines. Rowan looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his face was something she had not often seen there, not the steadiness, which was always there, but something underneath it, something that the steadiness had been covering the way a still surface covers depth. His eyes were gray in the porch light, and they had the look of someone who has been waiting for a door to open and cannot quite believe it has.
I've been waiting for you to know that for yourself.
He said. Before I said anything, I wasn't going to say it first and have you wonder whether it was complicated, given everything. It's not complicated, she said. No, he said, it's not. He reached across the space between the chairs and covered her hand with his, and she turned her hand over and held on. And the night came down through the pines, the way night does without asking, without ceremony, just arriving because it was time. Inside the cabin, Nell's singing continued, wandering and tuneless and quietly joyful. The months that followed were the busiest of Mara's adult life, which was saying something because she had not lived quietly. The land on the lower road came through in early February, purchased with the Missouri inheritance, and a precise, unsentimental transaction that was completed in the county clerk's office with Ruth Abernathy as witness, and a clerk named Peterson, who was efficient and polite, and, Mara thought, faintly perplexed by the assembled company of a twice-widowed woman, 60-year-old former homesteader, and a quiet mountain man who had not been asked to sign anything, but had driven everyone there and was waiting outside with the patience of granite. The building began in March, when the ground thawed enough to work. Rowan had spent the winter planning it with the same methodical attention he gave everything, not grandly, not with any ambitions toward grandeur, but practically, what a structure needed to house multiple families, how many rooms, how the kitchen should be laid out for communal use, how much wood a winter required and where to store it. He drew plans. Windows were dark. He drew plans on paper in the evenings, and Mara looked at them and made suggestions, and he incorporated some and explained why others wouldn't work, and she learned more about construction in those evenings than she'd learned in her entire prior life. He hired two in the county seat who were competent and showed up when they said they would, which he told her was rarer than it should be. Ruth Abernathy contributed money. She said she had been saving for something and had decided this was the something. Clara Briggs sent a letter saying she wanted to help and enclosed enough to cover the window glass, which was, as it turned out, one of the most expensive single items. The girls were involved in everything because that was how the cabin operated, that things that happened to the family happened to all of it. Tessa asked questions about the building process. With the same relentless practicality she brought to everything and absorbed the answers, and by mid-April was explaining load-bearing walls to Nell with enough accuracy that the carpenters overheard her and looked mildly astonished. Nell helped where she could and was mostly interested in where the garden would go, which she had decided would be on the south side, same as the cabins, because south-facing slopes got more sun. And she knew this because Mara had told her, and she had remembered everything Mara had ever told her with the specific devotion of a 6-year-old who has decided someone is worth learning from. It went up slowly. That was the truth of it. Nothing about it was fast or easy or particularly beautiful in its construction. There were setbacks, a delivery of lumber that came short and had to be supplemented, a week of rain in May that stopped work entirely, a disagreement with the carpenters about the roof pitch that Rowan won on structural grounds and Mara won on practical grounds. And the actual result was a compromise that both of them thought was better than their original positions, which was something they acknowledged to each other, but not to the carpenters. By June, it had walls and a roof. By July, it had a kitchen and 4 rooms and a porch that did not lean. By August, it had a garden along the south wall and water access from the creek and a name. Hearthstone House. Tessa named it. She had been thinking about it for weeks, she said, and she had rejected 12 other names before arriving at this one, and she presented it at supper one evening with the quiet authority of a conclusion reached by rigorous process. Hearthstone, Mara said. A hearthstone is the flat stone in front of a fireplace, Tessa said, in case anyone needed the definition. It's the part that everyone walks across. It takes the wear so the rest of the house doesn't have to. She looked at Mara. I think that's what it's going to be. Mara looked at this 9-year-old, she was 9 now, had been 9 since April, had received a small celebration of it, involving a cake that Nell had helped make, and that listed slightly to the left, but tasted excellent, and thought about standing in a road in Blackthorn Crossing and being dragged, and 2 small girls stepping into that road, and a hand held out without conditions. I think you're right, Mara said. The first woman came to Hearthstone House in September. Her name was Agnes. She was 34 and had 2 children under 5 and had walked 11 miles from a town north of Blackthorn Crossing with almost nothing, because almost nothing was what she had left after the things she was leaving, which she described in fragments and didn't need to describe in full because Mara understood fragments. Mara showed her the room. It was plain rope bed, window facing east, hook on the wall. She showed her the kitchen, the garden, the way things worked. Each of its windows were dark. She told her what she could expect and what would be expected, which was work and honesty and the willingness to eventually leave when she was ready. Because the point was not permanent refuge, but a place to get your feet under you. Most of its windows were dark. Agnes stood in the room. Mara showed her and looked at it with the specific expression of someone who has been in difficult places for long enough that adequate feels like abundance. I can work, Agnes said. I know, Mara said. That's not why I'm showing you the room. You can have the room because you need it. Agnes looked at her. Her eyes were the kind of eyes that have been waiting a long time to stop performing fine. Nobody just gives things, Agnes said. Mara thought about a hand held out without conditions, about the specific, difficult work of accepting something that didn't have a trap in it, about standing on a stump in a yard and calculating the cost of walking towards safety and not being able to find one. I know, she said. I thought the same thing. She held the door open. But here you are. Come in. Agnes came in. The children came in behind her, small and watchful, and Nell appeared from somewhere with the instinct she had for small children who needed managing and directed them immediately toward the kitchen garden with the authority of someone who has been entrusted with showing newcomers the garden and takes the responsibility seriously. Mara stood in the hallway of Hearthstone's house and listened to the sounds of it, Agnes's children following Nell. Nell explaining about the south-facing slope, the creak of the new floorboards, the fire in the kitchen that Ruth had lit that morning, before she arrived from Carr County for her weekly visit, in which she reviewed any documentation that had come in and explained to whatever women were present and what the law actually said about debts and rights, and what happened when someone produced a document. Rowan appeared beside her, because he was often beside her now, easily and without ceremony, the way things are when they found their natural arrangement. First one, he said. First one, she agreed. He looked at the hallway, at the new wood and the 2 doors and the sound of the kitchen. How does it feel? She thought about it. Not the answer she was supposed to give, not the clean, finished answer that would sound like a conclusion. The actual one. Like the beginning of something I don't fully understand yet, she said. Which is, I think that's probably right. I think if I fully understood it already, it wouldn't be the right thing. He considered this. That's probably true. I'm usually right, she said. Usually, he said, with a quality in his voice that she had come to recognize as his version of humor, dry as a creek bed in August. She looked at him. Right there in the hallway of the thing she had built, with the sound of Nell and Agnes's children in the garden, and Ruth's voice explaining something precise and calm in the kitchen, and the late summer light coming through the east window and lying on the new floorboards right there. In all of that, she understood something she had been working toward for a long time, without knowing the shape of it. She was not the woman who had been dragged through the dirt in Blackthorn Crossing. She was also not a woman who had left that woman behind and pretended she'd never existed. She was both the woman who had been broken down to almost nothing and the woman who had come back from it and built something. And the second one was made of everything the first one had survived, and neither one was a stranger to her. That was not a comfortable thing to carry. It was not supposed to be, but it was hers. She turned back toward the kitchen. There was supper to start, and Agnes's children would be hungry, and most of its windows were dark, and Ruth probably had opinions about the bread she had to make yesterday that Mara was going to hear regardless. And Tessa would be home from the county school before dark, and would arrive with opinions about everything and expect to be heard, and Rowan would fix the hinge on the back door that had been loose for a week because she'd mentioned it, and mentioning things once to Rowan was sufficient. And somewhere in all of that ordinary accumulation, which was not romantic and was not perfect, and was sometimes exhausting, and occasionally frustrating, and frequently loud, there was the thing she had spent 14 months of nearly being destroyed, not knowing she was building toward. She went to start supper. Agnes stayed for 4 months. That was longer than Mara had initially expected, and shorter than Agnes had feared, which meant it was probably about right. She left in January with her 2 children and a position secured at a seamstress shop in a town 30 miles east. Most of its windows were dark, arranged through a letter Ruth Abernathy had written to a woman she knew there who needed competent hands, and had agreed to hold a room above the shop as part of the arrangement. Agnes had cried when she left, not from sadness exactly, but from the specific emotion that has no clean name, the one that comes when you've been somewhere that gave you something real, and you're leaving it, and you know you need to leave it, and both things are true at the same time. Mara had stood in the yard of Hearthstone House and watched the wagon take Agnes and her children down the lower road toward the main track, and she had felt the particular mixture of things she's learning to recognize as the texture, the satisfaction of watching someone go because they were ready to, tangled up with the missing that started before the wagon was even out of sight. She had not expected the missing. She had thought of Hearthstone House in terms of what it gave. She had not fully thought through what it would cost her, emotionally. Each time someone was ready to leave, and each time that cost arrived, she had to decide again whether it was worth it, and each time she decided yes. And each time it was a genuine decision rather than a foregone conclusion, which she thought was probably important. Ruth had said, on one of her weekly visits, that the missing was the point. If you didn't miss them, Ruth said, it would mean you hadn't actually known them. And if you hadn't actually known them, what was the point of any of it? Mara had sat with this for a few days and decided Ruth was right, which Ruth generally was, and which Ruth was generally aware of, though she had the grace not to be insufferable about it most of the time. By the second winter of Hearthstone House, things had found a rhythm. Not a smooth, one rhythm, and smooth were not the same thing, and anyone who thought they were had never tried to run a communal household with rotating residents, 2 growing children, a weekly visiting legal advisor, and a husband who was in high demand as a carpenter and builder. Now that word had spread about the quality of his work. The rhythm was more like music with a complicated time signature, the kind that required actual attention to follow. There were almost always 2 or 3 women at Hearthstone House at any given time, sometimes more. They came from different directions and different circumstances, some referred by Ruth's growing network of contacts across the territory, some Setsons who had heard by the quiet underground of women's word of mouth that there was a place on the lower road outside Blackthorn Crossing where you could go if you had nowhere else. Some who arrived having walked distances that Mara didn't learn until later because they'd mentioned them casually, as though long walks were ordinary, which, for some of them, they had been. Each one was different. Each one required reading. Mara had learned early and sometimes painfully that what she herself had needed when she arrived at Rowan's cabin, the space to work and recover without being pressed for gratitude or explanation, was not what every woman needed. Some women needed to talk extensively before they could do anything else. Some needed structure as a comfort rather than a constraint. Some needed to be left entirely alone for 2 days before they could be approached at all. Some arrived. Some so angry that the anger had to find somewhere to go before anything else could happen. And Mara had learned to let it go where it needed to go without taking it personally, which was easier in principle than in practice. One woman, a 30-year-old named Dora, who arrived in October of the second year, was angry at everyone and made no particular effort to conceal it. She was angry at Mara, angry at Ruth, angry at the other women in the house, angry at the house itself, angry at the particular arrangement of the kitchen that was not how she would have arranged it if it were her kitchen, which it was not. Mara had been patient with this for about 2 weeks, at which point she and Dora had a direct conversation in the kitchen after supper that was, by anyone's definition, an argument, and that covered several subjects, including whether Dora intended to do her portion of the household work and whether she was going to speak to the other residents as though they were people, and whether she understood that Hearthstone House was not a place where you came to warehouse your anger at everyone else while they arranged themselves around it. Dora had said several things during this argument that were not fair and that hit harder than they were probably intended to, because Dora, like many people who are deeply frightened, had an instinct for the specific pressure points of whoever she was fighting with. Mara had held her ground. The argument ended without resolution, which arguments often do, and Dora went to her room, and Mara went to the porch, and sat in the dark for a while, and felt the familiar question, Was she the right person for this? Did she have what it took? Was the gap between what she wanted Hearthstone House to be and what she was actually capable of sustaining wider than she could manage? Rowan came out after a while and sat in the other chair. I heard some of that, he said. I wasn't quiet. No. She looked at the dark. She said I was running a charity operation to make myself feel better about being dragged through the dirt, that I was using other people's suffering to build myself a reputation. Rowan was quiet. She's wrong, Mara said, but she's also not entirely wrong, in the sense that there's no version of this where my own history isn't part of why I'm doing it. And I don't know if that makes it less honest or more. Why does it have to be one or the other? Rowan said. She looked at him. People build things for mixed reasons, he said. You rescued 2 children because you recognized something painful and it moved you. The fact that it came from your own pain doesn't make it less real. It makes it exactly as real as it is. He paused. Dora's angry because she's frightened. She'll stop leading with anger when she feels safer. That's not your fault, and it's not your failure. Mara sat with this. She might not stop, she might not, he agreed. Some people don't. And then what? And then you've still done everything you can do, he said, and that's where your responsibility ends. Dora did stop. As it turned out, not suddenly, not completely, but by increments. The way people soften when the environment around them turns out to be consistently more reliable than their defenses were built for. It took 6 weeks. By the end of them, she was doing her share of the kitchen work without being asked and had developed, improbably, a friendship with a woman named Pearl, who had arrived 2 weeks after Dora and had a temperament so different from Dora's that their friendship made a kind of sense that only opposites make. Pearl left in spring. Dora stayed another month, and then left too, headed north to a ranch where sister lived, and had offered her a place. She said goodbye to Mara in the yard on a Tuesday morning, which was not dramatic, and was better for not being dramatic, and she said, I know I was hard to be around. You were going through something hard, Mara said. That's not an excuse. No, Mara agreed, but it's a reason. Dora nodded with the expression of someone filing something away. She climbed onto the wagon. That a neighbor had agreed to take her part of the way north, and she looked at Mara once more before the wagon moved. What you're doing here, she said. It matters. I know I didn't act like it did. I know, Mara said. The wagon went. Mara stood in the yard and missed her, and went back inside. That spring also brought the formal proceedings against Silas Vane's lawyer, whose name was Edmund Calder, and who had, it turned out, been considerably more central to the operation than even Ruth had initially documented. Territorial bar proceedings were lengthy and technical, and Mara was not required to testify in them, which was a relief, though she followed their progress through Ruth's letters with the attention of someone who has a stake in the outcome. Calder was disbarred in May. Silas Vane, facing the accumulated weight of 7 county proceedings and 2 territorial fraud charges, negotiated an arrangement with the territorial court that involved repayment to his victims and a period of supervised removal from the territory, which was not as complete a consequence as Mara might have preferred, but was, Ruth explained in her precise way, more than most men like him received, and more than all of his victims had expected when they first came forward. Clara Briggs got her $112 back. She wrote Mara a letter about it that was 3 sentences long and entirely sufficient. The money was returned. She had paid her brother-in-law in full, and she had enclosed a small additional amount as a contribution to Hearthstone House. The additional amount was not large. Mara put it in the account she'd opened at the county bank for Hearthstone House and wrote Clara back to thank her and to tell her that the building now had a proper cook stove that had previously been a significant gap in the kitchen's functioning, and that the stove was now responsible for considerably better bread than the previous arrangement had produced. Clara wrote back asking for the bread recipe. Mara sent it. The question of Tessa and Nell had been sitting in the legal category of Rowan's life since the beginning in a way that was functionally unimportant. The girls were his, in every way that mattered, and no one had disputed that, but formally unresolved. The institution he'd taken them from had closed in the intervening years, its administrator having been removed following an investigation that Mara suspected Ruth had something to do with, though Ruth was quiet on the subject in a way that confirmed rather than denied it. With the institution gone, there was no organization with a standing claim, but there was also no formal document establishing Rowan as guardian in the eyes of the territorial court. Mara raised this with him in the fall of their second year at Hearthstone House because she had been thinking about it, and because she had learned that the things she was thinking about and not saying tended to accumulate into problems, and she preferred to name things early. I know, he said when she raised it. I've been thinking about it. It should be formalized. Both of us. He looked at her. They were married by then, had married the previous spring, quietly, beside the cabin in the pine country where they'd started, with Ruth Abernathy as witness, the girls in their good dresses, and a justice of the peace who drove out from the county seat and performed the ceremony in the practical, unemotional manner of a man who does this professionally and does not see the need for theater. It had been right exactly that way. Mara had not wanted theater. Both of us, he said. I'm their mother, Mara said. I want it to say so, somewhere official. Something moved in Rowan's face, the thing that happened there when she said something that went below the steady surface of him. He recovered it, as he always did, but not before she saw it. I'll write to the county court Monday, he said. The formal guardianship proceedings took 3 months and required 2 trips to the county seat and more paperwork than Mara had generated in her entire life prior to Hearthstone House, and were complicated slightly by Tessa, who had opinions about the proceedings and communicated them to the court clerk in a letter she wrote without telling anyone, which Mara only discovered when the clerk mentioned it in correspondence as an unusual but not unprecedented occurrence. What did you write? Mara asked her. Tessa was 10 by then, which had not made her less Tessa, but had given her Tessa-ness more vocabulary to work with. I told him that Rowan has been our father since I was 8, and that you've been our mother since I was 9, and that the law should catch up to what's already true. Mara looked at her for a moment. You wrote that to a court clerk. It's accurate, Tessa said. It was, in fact, accurate, and the court had apparently agreed because the proceedings moved forward without further complication, and the document that arrived in December named Rowan and Mara Thorne as legal guardians of Tessa and Nell, which was what was already true, and what Tessa had said was already true, and which the law had now, as instructed, caught up to. Nell received the news by asking if this meant she could stop worrying about it, and when told yes, went back to what she'd been doing. Most of its windows were dark, which was drawing a picture of the kitchen garden with considerably more artistic confidence than she'd had at 6, though still with a distinctive quality that was entirely her own. She wasn't worried, Tessa said, watching Nell. She was, Mara said. She just didn't show it. Tessa considered this. Like me. A little bit, yes. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Do you think about the road? She asked. In Blackthorn Crossing. The day. Mara looked at her. The question came from somewhere real, not idle curiosity, but the kind of question a person has been carrying and has finally decided to put down. Sometimes, Mara said, less than I used to. I think about it, Tessa said. I think about the part before I stepped in. The part where I was deciding. What was the deciding like? Tessa frowned slightly, working at the accuracy. Scary, she said, and also like there wasn't really another option. Not because I had to, but because I would have been different afterward if I hadn't. Different kind of person than I wanted to be. Mara looked at this 10-year-old who had been 8 and decided and stepped into a road and thought about all the ways she had tried to thank her over the years, and all the ways those thanks had never quite contained what she actually meant. You made me different too, Mara said. The kind of different that's better. Tessa absorbed this with the seriousness it deserved. Then she went to go help Nell with the kitchen garden drawing, offering corrections that Nell mostly ignored. The years moved the way years do when you're inside them, not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific weight of time that is being actually used. Hearthstone's house grew by increments. A new room added in the 3rd year when Rowan had time and the need was clear. Kitchen garden that Nell designed and managed with a seriousness that had everyone who saw it revising their estimate of what a 12-year-old was capable of. Ruth's visits became less frequent as her own projects multiplied. She had begun working directly with 2 county judges as an informal consultant on documentation fraud, which was not a paid position, but was exactly the kind of thing Ruth would do for free, because it needed doing and she was the person who knew how. They still wrote to each other, Mara and Ruth, with the regularity of people who have agreed that the relationship matters and are willing to do the work of maintaining it across distance. The letters had changed over the years, less urgency, more texture. Ruth wrote about the cases she was consulting on, the specific patterns of fraud that kept appearing with variations, the judges who were learning and the ones who weren't. Mara wrote about Hearthstone House, about the women who came and went, about the particular challenges of building something that depended on human beings who were unreliable and complicated and the only available material. She wrote to Clara Briggs occasionally too. Clara had left the seamstress shop after 18 months and opened her own small operation with a partner. Most of its windows were dark, which was doing well enough that her last letter mentioned she had paid off the debt to her brother-in-law twice over and was considering a different building for the shop and wasn't sure the timing was right. Mara wrote back, "The timing is never right. You do it anyway." Clara wrote back 3 weeks later saying she'd signed the lease. In the 4th year, something unexpected happened, which was that Blackthorn Crossing changed. Not entirely, not dramatically. Towns don't change like that, and anyone who expects to is expecting the wrong thing from a collection of human beings who have their own momentum and their own reasons for being what they are. But something shifted, incrementally, in the way the town related to Hearthstone House and to Mara herself, and it was impossible to say exactly when it started, or what the first cause was. Part of it was practical. Hearthstone House had by then housed over 20 women and perhaps 30 children, and many of those women had connections to Blackthorn Crossing, either by proximity or by the web of relationships that develops when you're within a day's ride of a community. Some of the women who left Hearthstone House ended up in Blackthorn Crossing itself, or had family there who had heard their accounts of the place on the lower road that had helped them. Word traveled the way it does in small communities, which is through the specific channels of people who know each other and trust certain voices, and those voices, one by one, were saying something about Mara Ellsworth Thorne and the building she'd put up. Part of it was Hector Pruitt, who had apparently decided that his letter was not the end of his reckoning and had been quietly, consistently, without fanfare, sending supplies to Hearthstone House for 4 years, flour and cornmeal and lamp oil and other practical things, delivered with a regularity that was its own kind of statement. He had never asked for acknowledgement of this, and Mara had given him genuine acknowledgement rather than performative gratitude, which she thought he preferred, and which seemed to be the right call, because he kept sending the supplies. Part of it was time. Just time, which is the most underrated healer in the world, not because it erases things, but because it deposits new layers over them, new events and new relationships and new facts, until the old thing is still there but is no longer the top layer. And part of it, the part that was hardest to quantify, but was probably the most real, was that Mara had simply continued to exist. She had continued to be visible, to walk into Blackthorn Crossing when she had reason to be spoken of in connection with real and specific things she had done, and the accumulation of her continued existence had eventually become its own argument. You cannot erase someone who keeps showing up. You cannot define someone as worthless who keeps doing work that has visible worth. The town had not apologized in any formal or collective way. Towns don't do that. And she didn't want them to, because a collective apology was a performance, and she had no interest in performing forgiveness she hadn't fully arrived at. But the town had adjusted. The particular blankness with which people had looked through her had, over time, been replaced by the kind of ordinary regard one person gives another, which was all she had ever wanted and all she had ever deserved. Buck Harlan was the exception, and she had made her peace with exceptions. He remained what he was. He did not send supplies. He did not seek her out. He had not, as far as she knew, reconsidered the afternoon in the road, because reconsidering would have required a kind of internal equipment that he simply did not possess. She had spent a fair amount of time in the early years being angry about this, and then a lesser amount of time being angry about it, and then one ordinary Wednesday, she had noticed that she hadn't thought about Buck Harlan in several weeks, and she had recognized that as its own resolution, not forgiveness, not indifference, just the natural reduction of something to its actual size, which was smaller than it had seemed when it was the defining feature of her life. Tessa was the one who encountered him, eventually. She was 12 when it happened, old enough to navigate Blackthorn Crossing independently for errands, which she did with the efficiency of someone who has a list and intends to complete it. She ran into Buck Harlan outside the feed store in the specific spatial awkwardness of two people who are occupying the same stretch of boardwalk and both know who the other person is. She told Mara about it that evening with the forensic detail she brought to anything that interested her. He looked like he expected me to move out of his way, Tessa said. What did you do? I didn't move, Tessa said. I looked at him and I said, Mr. Harlan, the way you're supposed to greet adults, and I kept walking. And he said, Miss Thorne, Tessa said and moved aside. She paused. He called me Miss Thorne. Mara sat with this for a moment. The name. Her name that Tessa carried now. The name of the woman he'd watched being dragged in the road, attached to the child who had stepped into it. How did that feel? Mara asked. Tessa thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything. Like something settling, she said. I don't know what. Just settling. Mara understood exactly what she meant. The winter Tessa was 15. She announced at supper that she intended to go to teacher's college. This was not a surprise in the sense of being unexpected. Tessa had been talking about education with the intensity of someone building toward a specific destination for years, but it was a surprise in sense of its arrival the specific evening in December when she put her fork down and made it a statement rather than a conversation topic. I've written to 3 programs, she said. I've had responses from 2. There's one in the county seat and one in Laramie. Laramie is better. Rowan looked at her. Laramie is 400 miles. I know, Tessa said. I counted. Mara looked at Rowan and then back at Tessa, at this girl who had been 8 years old in a road with her arms out and who was now 15 and had written to 3 programs and received responses from 2 and already knew which was better. Tell me about the program, Mara said. Tessa told her, in considerable detail. Mara asked questions and Tessa answered them, and Rowan asked questions that were more practical about cost, housing, the length of the program, what teaching certification required, and Tessa answered those too. Because of its windows were dark, because she had not made this announcement without preparing for the conversation, which was so entirely Tessa that Mara could have predicted it if she'd thought to. Nell was quiet through most of this, which was not her usual mode, and Mara noticed. After supper, when Tessa had gone to work on something and Rowan was seeing to the horse, Mara sat with Etta in the kitchen. Say it, Mara said. Nell was 13, and 13 had given her something that 6 and 10 hadn't quite had yet, a quality of interiority, of keeping things that she was still working out how to balance against her instinct to be open. She had her mother's eyes. Mara had sometimes thought, meaning the mother she'd never known, because there was something in the specific way Nell's eyes registered feeling that had always seemed to come from a place Mara couldn't fully account for. I don't want her to go, Nell said. I know, 400 miles is very far. It is. Nell looked at the table. She's been there every day of my life that I can remember. The institution, and then Rowan, and then here. She's always been right there. She said this was with the flat, precise quality of someone stating a fact that has just revealed its own fragility. I know she should go. I know Laramie is better, and I know She stopped. Don't want her to. Mara put her hand over Nell's on the table. Both of those things are true at the same time. The not wanting and the knowing. Yes. They don't cancel each other out. No. Nell looked up. Did you know when Agnes left? That first time, did you feel like that? Mara thought about standing in the yard, watching the wagon go down the lower road. Yes, but she was supposed to go. Yes. And I missed her before the wagon was out of sight. She looked at Nell. That's what it means to love something. It costs you when it goes where it's supposed to go. That's not a malfunction. That's just what love feels like from this end of it. Nell sat with this for a long moment. Okay, she said, eventually. Just that. The word of someone who has decided to accept something that is not particularly easy to accept. Tessa went to Laramie the following September. The leaving was practical and somewhat rushed because the departure date had gotten compressed by logistics, and the goodbye was not the scene it might have been in a different telling of this story. Tessa hugged Nell for a long time and then stepped back and said, very seriously, you're the best person I know. And Nell said, I know, which made Tessa laugh in the unguarded way she almost never did, and then Tessa hugged Mara and said nothing, just held on, and Mara held on back and felt the specific weight of her, the physical reality of this person who had been 8 years old in a road and was now almost 16 and going to Laramie. Rowan drove her to the stage. Mara did not go, because she and Tessa had agreed privately that the stage platform would be harder than the yard, and they preferred the yard, the Movitz Betos dark, and she watched the wagon go down the lower road the same way she'd watched Agnes's wagon 4 years earlier, with the missing starting before the wheels had cleared the gate. Binitz. She went back inside and found Nell in the kitchen making tea with the deliberate focus of someone who needs something to do with their hands. She'll write, Mara said. She'll write extensively, Nell said. She'll have opinions about the program within the first week, and she'll communicate them in detail. This was so accurate that it made them both, quietly, laugh. Tessa did write, extensively and with opinions. She wrote about the program, about the other students, about the instructors she respected, and the ones she found inadequate, and precisely why. She wrote about Laramie, its size, its noise, the specific challenges of navigating a larger world when you've grown up in pine country with 412 paces between the cabin and the creek. She wrote about a young man in her cohort who had interesting ideas about educational philosophy, and with whom she disagreed on 3 significant points and agreed on 2, and who she would further report on as the situation developed. Mara wrote back every week, so did Nell. Rowan wrote once a month in his careful, economical hand, which Tessa said in a letter was like receiving a telegram from someone who had important things to say, and was not wasting words, which was exactly right. Nell, in Tessa's absence, expanded into herself in ways that surprised everyone, including Nell. She had always been the quieter one, the softer one, the one with the drawings and the garden and the social instinct for small children, but without Tessa's gravitational pull, Nell discovered that she had her own pull. She became, over the following year, the person at Hearthstone House that new arrivals found first and most easily, with a quality of warmth that didn't read as charity but as genuine interest, genuine curiosity about the specific person in front of her. She remembered details. She asked the right questions. She could sit with someone who wasn't ready to talk, without filling the silence with things that weren't needed. Ruth noticed this on one of her visits. That girl, Ruth said to Mara, watching Nell across the yard where she was in conversation with a woman who had arrived 2 days ago and hadn't spoken more than 10 words since, and was now, apparently, speaking. She should be doing what you're doing. She is doing it, Mara said. She's been doing it for years. Formally, Ruth said. Officially. When she's old enough. She paused. She doesn't want to leave, does she? No, Mara said. This is where she's going. Ruth looked at her for a moment with those precise eyes. And Tessa is coming back eventually. Different, but back. Eventually, Mara agreed. You built this from nothing, Ruth said. And now she stopped, which was unusual for Ruth, who was not generally at a loss. I was going to say something about legacy, but that sounds like a funeral. It does, Mara agreed. What it is, Ruth said, more carefully, is a thing that outlasts the specific problem that created it. You built it because of what happened to you, but it doesn't depend on what happened to you anymore. It's its own thing now. Mara looked at Hearthstone House, at the south-facing garden where Nell had recently added a 3rd row of beds, at the new window Rowan had put in last fall that let the east light into the main room in the mornings, at the 2 women sitting on the porch who had been strangers 6 weeks ago and were now, by the alchemy of shared circumstance, something more than that. Yes, she said, that's what it is. There was an evening in the 5th year of Hearthstone House, the 7th year of Mara's life in the pine country, the life she had arrived at by taking a stranger's hand in a road that she would return to many times afterward, not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because of its particular quality, the way some ordinary evenings have a quality that tells you, while you're in them, that this is the thing you'll remember. It was summer late, the long light of a Wyoming July lying gold through the pines. Supper was done. 3 women were in the main room with Nell, talking in the unhurried way of people who have nowhere else they have to be tonight. One of them was laughing at something. Real laughter. The kind you can't perform. Rowan was on the porch, with a cup of coffee, and the particular expression of a man at rest in his own life, which was not a common expression on him, and which she therefore noticed when it appeared. She came and sat beside him, and he looked at her with those gray eyes and said nothing, because nothing was needed. The sound from inside, the laughter, the pines going amber in the last of the light. She thought about the road. She always thought about the road eventually, not with dread anymore, but with the specific interest of someone revisiting a place that shaped them, trying to understand its precise dimensions, what it actually was versus what it had felt like at the time. What it had been was a moment when a community decided she was less than they were and acted on that decision, and two children had stepped in front of it, and a man had stood behind them, and she had taken a hand and walked away. Simple, told that way. The simplest story in the world. Except that nothing about it had been simple, and the simpleness of the telling was its own kind of lie. What it had actually been was 14 months of accumulated humiliation, and a split second of decision, and years of the work of becoming someone who could do something with what she'd survived. The road was a moment. The rest of it, the real of it, was everything that came before and everything that came after, and you couldn't understand one without the other. She had thought for a long time that the important thing was the moment, the two girls stepping in the hand, the walking away, and those things were important. She would never say they weren't, because they were the hinge, the specific point at which everything bent in a different direction. But the real thing, the thing she understood now in a way she hadn't then, was what you did with the after. The hinge was not the door. The moment of rescue was not the rescue. You still had to decide, every subsequent morning, who you were going to be with what you'd been given, and the deciding never stopped being a decision. She had made a lot of wrong ones along the way. She knew that. She had been too slow to trust and then occasionally too quick. She had been harsher with some women who came to Hearthstone House than she should have been, and too easy on others who needed a firmer response. She had made financial decisions that were right and financial decisions that needed correcting. She had said things to Rowan in their first year of marriage that she'd had to go back and address honestly, not because marriages required perfection, but because they required honesty. And she had let fear masquerade as caution in a few conversations she should have had sooner. She was not a success story of the uncomplicated kind. She was a person who had survived something and built something and continued to be in the middle of building it, which she was also in the middle of making the mistakes that come with building things, and would probably be in the middle of making them for as long as she was alive. That was the real of it. Not the version where the woman who was dragged through the dirt becomes, through the transformative power of love and determination, someone without further difficulty. The version where she remains someone with difficulty, who is also, alongside the difficulty, doing real things in the world. She had written something like this to Clara Briggs once, in response to a letter where Clara had said she felt guilty for still struggling after all this time, as though her story should be done by now, as though surviving something entitled you to an end of subsequent hardship. Mara had written back, "The story doesn't end. It just changes what it's about. And changing what it's about is the whole point." Clara had written back, "I think I needed someone to say that." Mara had thought, "So did I. I needed someone to say it to me too. So I said it to myself, and then I said it to you." That was, she had come to think, how most of the important things worked. You figured windows were dark. You figured something out in the process of needing it, and then someone else needed it, and you found out you had it to give. "Rowan," she said, on the porch, in the last of the July light. I want to tell you something, all right?" She looked at the pines, at the evening light in them going amber to rose to the particular gray-blue that came just before full dark, at the yard of Hearthstone House, where two children had been playing earlier and where the marks of their playing were still in the dust. "I am the luckiest person I know," she said, "and I say that as someone who was dragged through a main street by her hair not that long ago, so I want you to understand I've done the comparison." Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's a fairly low bar," he said. "It's a very specific bar," she said. "The bar is, I know what bad looks like, and this is not bad." "No," he agreed. "It's not bad. It's actually what I would have wanted," she said more carefully. "If someone had asked me, before all of it, what I wanted. Place. Work that means something. People who are mine." She paused. "You." He set down his coffee cup on the porch rail and looked at her with those gray eyes in the fading light. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The simplest possible answer. The one that meant the most. Inside the house, the laughter came again. From one of the women in the main room, real and unperformed, and it went out through the open window into the summer evening, and the pines took it, and it went up into the last of the light. Mara sat on the porch of the house she had built, and listened to it. She had been worthless, once, according to Blackthorn Crossing. She had been a problem, a burden, a body to be removed from the road. She was not those things. She had never been those things. It had taken 2 children stepping into a road, and a hand, and years of the hard, ordinary work of becoming, for her to know that in her bones, rather than just in her head, to know it the way you know the creek is to the east. 412 paces, because you've walked it enough times that your feet know the number without being told. The dark came down through the pines, easy and unhurried, the way dark always does. The lamp inside this house made the window glow. The creek to the east made its noise, the same noise it had always made, the same noise it would be making long after all of them. Mara stayed on the porch until the stars came out. Then she went inside to her life.